fire in the Gryffindor common room crackled and spat, sending amber sparks spiraling up toward the vaulted ceiling, where they winked out like dying stars. Eliza Thornwood sat curled in the corner of a worn velvet armchair, its crimson fabric soft with age and countless students before her. The warmth should have been comforting. The house elves always kept the fires burning just right, neither too fierce nor too feeble. But tonight, it did nothing to ease the cold knot of dread settling in her stomach. Around her, the common room thrummed with the particular energy of a Sunday evening, that last gasp of weekend freedom before Monday morning lessons reclaimed them all. Third years sprawled across the carpet, practicing summoning charms on each other's quills amid shrieks of laughter. A group of seventh years occupied the best seats near the fireplace, their voices low and serious as they revised for NEWTs, occasionally glancing up to snap at the younger students to keep it down. The suits of armor in the corridor outside clanked rhythmically as they shifted position, the castle settling into its nighttime routines, familiar and eternal. But Eliza heard it all as if from underwater, muffled and distant. In her lap, the monster book of monsters lay docile, its furry spine rising and falling with what almost seemed like contented breathing. She kept one hand resting on it, fingers gently stroking the coarse hair, maintaining the careful peace she'd learned to broker with the temperamental textbook. Most students had given up, wrestling their copies into submission with spellotape or leather belts. Eliza had discovered that patience worked better than force. If only she could apply that lesson to herself. "Eliza, there you are." The voice cut through her thoughts like a beam of sunlight through storm clouds. She looked up to find Marcus Bellamy squeezing through the portrait hole, his yellow and black scarf still wrapped around his neck, despite the warmth of the tower. The fat lady's painted face peered after him with mild disapproval. Hufflepuffs weren't technically forbidden from Gryffindor Tower, but they were certainly unusual visitors. Marcus was unusual in many ways, where most friendships at Hogwarts formed along house lines, as naturally as water following a riverbed. He decided in their first year that Eliza needed a friend, and that was that. He'd sat beside her in herbology when she'd been too shy to find a partner, had shared his chocolate frogs on the Hogwarts Express, and had never once made her feel like her quietness was something that needed fixing. "What are you doing up here?" Eliza asked, though she couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips. "It's nearly curfew." "Exactly why I came now," Marcus said, dropping into the chair opposite hers with the comfortable ease of someone who belonged everywhere, simply because he decided to. His round face was flushed from the climb up the tower stairs, and his hair stuck up in odd directions. "Wanted to catch you before tomorrow. Care of magical creatures, first lesson?" The knot in Eliza's stomach pulled tighter. She'd been trying very hard not to think about tomorrow, which was rather like trying not to think about a dragon when one was sleeping on your feet. "Right," she said quietly, her gaze dropping back to her book. "Tomorrow." Marcus leaned forward, his brown eyes sharp despite his generally soft appearance. "You're worried?" It wasn't a question. That was the thing about Marcus. He noticed things. In a school full of loud, brave Gryffindors and ambitious, cunning Slytherins and brilliant, witty Ravenclaws, Marcus simply paid attention. It was his particular form of magic, wandless and unshowy. "I'm fine," Eliza said automatically. "Eliza." She sighed, her fingers still moving in slow, soothing strokes along the book's spine. Outside the tall windows, she could see the grounds falling away into darkness, the forbidden forest a black smudge against the slightly less black sky. Somewhere down there, past Hagrid's hut, the Hippogriffs were sleeping. Or perhaps they didn't sleep. Perhaps they stood through the night, alert and proud, those fierce orange eyes never truly closing. What if I can't do it? The words came out barely above a whisper, nearly lost in the crackle of the fire. What if I freeze, or do something wrong, or then Hagrid will help you, Marcus said firmly. That's what teachers do. And besides, you won't freeze. You never do when it actually matters. Eliza wanted to believe him. She'd watched Marcus approach a fully grown venomous tentacula in herbology last week with nothing but cheerful curiosity and a pair of dragon-hide gloves. He'd been sorted into Hufflepuff, yes, but there was a particular kind of courage in his loyalty, in the way he stood beside people when they needed standing beside. She'd been sorted into Gryffindor. The hat had barely touched her head before shouting it too, which somehow made it worse. No deliberation, no consideration of Ravenclaw, where her love of books might have fit, or Hufflepuff, where her quiet patience could have been an asset. Just straight to Gryffindor, the house of the brave, the bold, the bloody lion-hearted. She'd spent 3 years feeling like an imposter wearing the wrong colors. It's just... Eliza struggled to find the words, her eyes fixed on the flames dancing in the grate. A log shifted, sending up a fresh spray of sparks. Everyone expects Gryffindors to be brave, to charge in first, volunteer first, be, I don't know, like Harry Potter and his friends, like everyone else. Harry Potter got sorted into Gryffindor because he asked not to be in Slytherin, Marcus pointed out. My mum told me. It's all over the Prophet's archives. The hat wanted to put him in Slytherin, but he chose differently. Bravery isn't about not being afraid, Eliza. It's about what you do even when you are afraid. Before Eliza could respond, HR's burst of raucous laughter erupted from the group by the fire. Dean Thomas had apparently managed to summon Seamus Finnegan's wand right out of his hand, and now held it triumphantly aloft, while Seamus launched himself across the carpet in pursuit. Their scuffle knocked into a side table, sending a wizard chess set clattering to the floor. The pieces picked themselves up with indignant squeaks, the White Queen boxing the Black Knight's ears as they sorted themselves out. "Oi, watch it," called one of the 7th years, not even looking up from her transfiguration notes. The common room absorbed the chaos and continued on, the way Hogwarts always did. Centuries of students had laughed and fought and studied and worried within these walls. The stones remembered all of it, Eliza sometimes thought, every triumph and every fear. I heard Malfoy's class went on Friday, Marcus said, lowering his voice. The name alone was enough to draw attention in Gryffindor Tower, and not the good kind. With the Hippogriffs, apparently something happened. Hagrid was really shaken up about it. I saw him in the grounds yesterday, and he looked, well, not himself. Eliza had heard the rumors too. They'd swept through the castle like wildfire, growing and changing with each retelling. Draco Malfoy had insulted a hippogriff, or he'd been attacked unprovoked, or he'd done it deliberately to get Hagrid sacked. The stories varied depending on who was telling them and which house they belonged to, but the core remained the same. Someone had gotten hurt in care of magical creatures, and now everyone was either terrified or thrilled by the danger of it all. Mostly, Eliza was terrified. "That just makes it worse," she said, finally looking up to meet Marcus's eyes. "If Malfoy, who's never afraid of anything, got hurt, what chance do I have?" "Malfoy isn't unafraid," Marcus corrected gently. "He's reckless. There's a difference. Fear keeps you careful, keeps you respectful. Hagrid always says magical creatures deserve respect, right? Maybe that's exactly what they need. Someone who approaches them carefully instead of charging in like they own the world." The portrait hole swung open again, and a gaggle of second years tumbled through, their robes still damp from an evening by the lake. They were arguing about whether the giant squid had actually waved a tentacle at them or simply been stretching. Their voices added to the general din, bright and unconcerned with anything beyond their own small dramas. Eliza envied them, that lightness. "I should probably go," Marcus said, glancing at the ornate clock on the mantelpiece. Its hands were creeping toward 10 o'clock, and Filch would be prowling the corridors soon with Mrs. Norris, his skeletal cat, both of them eager to catch students out of bed. "But Eliza, you're going to be fine, better than fine. You're one of the bravest people I know." "I'm really not," Eliza said, but Marcus was already standing, adjusting his scarf. "You are. You just don't see it yet." He paused at the edge of her chair, his expression suddenly serious. "My Gran always says that courage isn't the same for everyone. For some people, it's fighting dark wizards. For others, it's getting up and facing the day when you'd rather hide under the covers. You get up every day, Eliza. You show up. That counts." He left before she could argue, squeezing back through the portrait hole with a final wave. The fat lady harumphed something about irregular visiting hours before settling back into her frame, and the common room continued its evening rituals around Eliza, like water flowing around a stone. She sat there for a long time, watching the fire burn lower, her hand still resting on her textbook. Students gradually filtered off to bed. The second years herded upstairs by a prefect. The seventh years finally abandoning their revision with groans and promises to continue in the morning. The common room emptied until only Eliza remained, the silence broken only by the snap of the fire and the distant sound of Peeves singing rudely somewhere in the castle's depths. Through the windows, she could see a few lights still burning in the castle. Professor McGonagall's office window glowing warm in the Transfiguration Tower, the hospital wing's pale illumination suggesting Madame Pomfrey was tending to some student's mishap. And far below, down past the sloping lawns and the vegetable patches, a light burned in Hagrid's hut. Was he preparing for tomorrow's lesson? Checking on the Hippogriffs? Making sure they were settled and safe? Or was he worrying, the way she was worrying, about everything that could go wrong? The thought was oddly comforting. Perhaps everyone was afraid sometimes, even groundskeepers who raised dragon hatchlings in wooden huts and kept three-headed dogs as pets. Eliza finally stirred from her chair, her muscles stiff from sitting still so long. The fire had burned down to sullen coals, and the house elves would be along soon to bank it properly for the night. She gathered her book, careful to keep stroking it so it wouldn't snap at her, and made her way to the spiral staircase leading to the girls' dormitories. The stone steps were worn smooth by generations of feet, cool even through her shoes. She passed the second-year dormitory, where she could hear whispered giggles and a prefect's voice calling for quiet. Then the third-year boys' room, where Ron Weasley and Harry Potter slept alongside Dean and Seamus and Neville. The thought that the Harry Potter, who'd faced you-know-who multiple times, who'd saved the Philosopher's Stone and killed a basilisk, might also get nervous before lessons seemed impossible. Heroes didn't feel what she felt, did they? The third-year girls' dormitory was quiet when she pushed open the door. 4 four-poster beds stood draped in scarlet and gold, their curtains drawn back to show the sleeping forms of her roommates. Lavender Brown was curled on her side, her blonde hair spread across the pillow like spilled sunshine. Parvati Patil lay on her back, one arm flung over her head, her breathing deep and even. Hermione Granger's bed was empty, probably still in the library, though how she got past curfew was a mystery Eliza had never quite solved. The fourth bed, tucked in the corner by the window, was Eliza's. She changed into her nightgown quietly, her movements practiced from 3 years of trying not to wake anyone. Lavender stirred once, mumbling something about Professor Trelawney and tea leaves, but didn't wake. Eliza slipped between her sheets, the cotton cool and smooth, smelling faintly of the lavender water the house elves used in the washing. But sleep didn't come. She lay there, staring up at the canopy of her bed, listening to her roommates breathe. Beyond the window, she could hear the wind picking up, rattling the glass in its frame. Autumn was settling over the highlands properly now, bringing shorter days and longer nights, the promise of winter lurking in every gust that swept down from the mountains. Tomorrow, she would walk down to Hagrid's paddock. Tomorrow, she would see the Hippogriffs up close, not from a safe distance, not in a drawing in a textbook, but real and alive and enormous. Tomorrow, she would be expected to approach one, to bow to it, to show the respect and courage that everyone assumed came naturally to Gryffindors. What if she couldn't do it? What if she stood there, frozen, while her classmates watched and whispered? What if the Hippogriff sensed her fear and took offense? What if she proved, once and for all, that the Sorting Hat had made a mistake 3 years ago, and she didn't belong in the House of the Brave after all? Eliza rolled onto her side, pulling the blankets up to her chin. Through the window, she could just make out the grounds below, the dark sweep of the lawn, the glitter of the lake where moonlight caught the ripples, and far, far away, the black wall of the forbidden forest where creatures both wonderful and terrible made their homes. Somewhere out there, the Hippogriffs were settling in for the night. She imagined them in their paddock, their eagle heads tucked beneath powerful wings, their horse bodies at rest but alert, always alert. Proud creatures, Hagrid had called them in the corridor last week when she'd overheard him talking to Professor McGonagall. Proud and noble and deserving of respect. Could she give them that? Could she set aside her own fears long enough to show proper respect? The castle creaked around her, its ancient stones shifting in that way they did at night, almost like breathing. Portraits murmured to each other in distant corridors. A ghost drifted past outside, visible for a moment through the window. The Grey Lady, perhaps, on her endless circuit of the towers. The suits of armor in the hallways clanked into their resting positions. Hogwarts was settling down to sleep, and Eliza was still wide, awake. She thought about what Marcus had said, about courage being different for everyone. She thought about Harry Potter, who'd asked the Hat not to sort him into Slytherin. He'd been afraid, hadn't he? afraid of what Slytherin might mean, what it might make him. But he'd still ended up facing trolls and basilisks and dementors. Maybe bravery wasn't about not being afraid. Maybe it was just about taking the next step anyway. The wind gusted again, stronger this time, and Eliza closed her eyes. Tomorrow would come whether she was ready or not. The Hippogriffs would be there, proud and fierce and waiting. Hagrid would be there too, with his wild hair and his gentle heart, and his absolute certainty that all creatures deserved a chance. And she would be there, shy, uncertain, sorted into a house that still felt like someone else's home. But she would be there. That had to count for something. As sleep finally began to creep over her, soft and gradual as fog rolling in from the lake, Eliza's last conscious thought was of wings. Great powerful wings that could carry someone up into the sky, away from the ground and all its fears, if only they could find the courage to hold on. Tomorrow, she would find out if she had that courage. Tomorrow, she would try. Outside, the wind died down, and the castle grew quiet. The fires in the common rooms burned low. The house elves moved silently through the halls, tending to their endless tasks with invisible efficiency. In Hagrid's paddock, a dark-feathered hippogriff raised its head, amber eyes reflecting the moonlight, as if sensing something on the wind. And in her corner bed in Gryffindor Tower, Eliza Thornwood finally slept, her dreams full of feathers and flight, and the distant sound of wings beating against an endless sky. The morning arrived with the particular cruelty of autumn mornings in the Scottish Highlands, cold, grey, and utterly indifferent to Eliza's wishes that it might never come at all. She woke to lavender brown yanking open the curtains with far too much enthusiasm, letting watery sunlight spill across the dormitory floor. Parvati groaned and pulled her pillow over her head. Hermione's bed, Eliza noticed, looked slept in, but was already empty. She'd probably been up for hours, likely in the common room reviewing her notes before breakfast. "Come on, sleepyheads," Lavender chirped, already half-dressed in her school robes. "It's Monday. We've got care of magical creatures this afternoon. Aren't you excited?" Eliza's stomach performed a complicated maneuver that would have impressed the Chudley Cannon's seeker. Excited was not the word she would have chosen. Terrified, perhaps. Nauseated, certainly. But Lavender was already chattering about whether the Hippogriffs would let them fly, and Parvati was sitting up with sleepy interest. So Eliza simply pulled back her own curtains and began the process of preparing for a day she desperately wished she could skip. The Gryffindor common room was already buzzing with activity when she made her way down the spiral staircase, her book bag heavy with her Transfiguration textbook and the now docile Monster Book of Monsters. The morning light streaming through the tall windows turned the scarlet and gold furnishings warm and rich, but did nothing to settle the nervous flutter in her chest. Hermione sat at one of the tables near the fireplace, her bushy hair forming a wild halo around her head as she bent over what appeared to be 3 separate essays simultaneously. Harry and Ron were nowhere to be seen, probably still in bed, Eliza thought, and felt a brief stab of envy for their ability to sleep through Lavender's wake-up calls. The walk down to breakfast felt longer than usual. The castle was in full Monday morning chaos, students rushing to classes they were already late for, ghosts drifting through walls with helpful directions that only confused matters more, and Peeves wreaking havoc somewhere in the direction of the library if the shrieks and Professor Pince's outraged voice were any indication. The great hall smelled of porridge and toast and pumpkin juice, overlaid with the particular scent of Monday morning anxiety that seemed to permeate the very stones. The enchanted ceiling showed a sky full of sullen grey clouds, promising rain later. The floating candles bobbed gently in some unfelt breeze, casting wavering shadows across the 4 long house tables. Eliza slid into an empty spot at the Gryffindor table, between a group of second years quizzing each other on potions ingredients and a pair of 6th years arguing about the proper wand movement for conjuring spells. She served herself porridge mechanically, not tasting it, her eyes drifting toward the staff table where Hagrid sat at the far end. He looked nervous. Even from this distance, she could see the way he kept fidgeting with his napkin, his wild hair and beard seeming even more unkempt than usual. Professor McGonagall sat beside him, speaking in low tones that Eliza couldn't hear, but her expression was kind. On Hagrid's other side, Professor Dumbledore was methodically working his way through a piece of toast, his blue eyes twinkling as he appeared to half-listen to Professor Flitwick's animated story about something or other. The sight of Hagrid's nervousness made Eliza feel marginally better and significantly worse. If even Hagrid, who had faced dragons and giant spiders, and Merlin knew what else, could be nervous about teaching, then perhaps her own fear wasn't quite so pathetic. But it also meant that today's lesson might actually be as dangerous as her imagination insisted on believing. Morning, Eliza. She jumped, nearly upsetting her pumpkin juice. Marcus had appeared across from her, his own breakfast plate piled high with eggs and bacon and several slices of toast. He grinned at her startled expression. "Sorry, didn't mean to scare you." He bit into a piece of bacon with the satisfied air of someone who'd slept perfectly well and wasn't facing any existential crises about their house placement. "Ready for this afternoon?" "Define ready," Eliza muttered, pushing her porridge around her bowl. "Well, you're awake and dressed, so that's a start." Marcus loaded marmalade onto his toast with cheerful efficiency. "I've been reading up on hippogriffs. Did you know they're related to griffins? Or at least, that's what some magizoologists think. The theory is that a wizard centuries ago bred a griffin with a horse, probably because they thought, hey, you know what griffins need? More horse." Despite herself, Eliza felt a small smile tug at her lips. This was Marcus's particular gift, the ability to make even terrifying things seem somehow more manageable through sheer enthusiastic rambling about their history or biology or whatever random fact he'd picked up in his reading. "The important thing," Marcus continued, waving his toast for emphasis, "is that they're intelligent, really intelligent. They can understand human speech, some researchers think, and they definitely understand intent. So if you approach them with respect and genuine interest, they know. They can tell." "What if they can tell I'm terrified?" Eliza asked quietly. Marcus paused mid-bite, his expression softening. "Then they'll know you're taking them seriously. That's not a bad thing, Eliza. Fear and respect aren't that different, really. It's arrogance that gets people hurt, thinking you're better than them, that they should bow to you instead of earning it." Before Eliza could respond, a flurry of wings and hooting filled the great hall as the morning post arrived. Dozens of owls swooped through the high windows, dropping letters and packages onto the tables below. A small barn owl dropped a copy of the Daily Prophet onto the staff table, nearly landing in Professor Snape's pumpkin juice. The potions master's expression suggested he was considering assigning detention to the owl. At the Slytherin table, Eliza noticed Draco Malfoy holding court among his usual crowd of followers. His arm was in a sling, a rather dramatic, gleaming white sling that seemed designed to draw maximum attention. He was speaking loudly enough for half the hall to hear, something about dangerous creatures and incompetent teaching, and his father hearing about it. Crabbe and Goyle nodded along like matching bookends, while Pansy Parkinson made sympathetic cooing noises. "Bet that sling comes off the moment Madame Pomfrey's not looking," Marcus muttered, following Eliza's gaze. "My cousin's in Slytherin. She said Malfoy's been milking it all weekend. Apparently the injury wasn't even that bad." Still, Eliza thought, it had been bad enough. A hippogriff had hurt a student. That was real, regardless of Malfoy's dramatics. The morning lessons passed in a blur of anxious distraction. Transfiguration with Professor McGonagall found Eliza staring at the mouse she was supposed to be turning into a snuff box, her wand raised, but her mind entirely elsewhere. McGonagall paused beside her desk, her stern expression softening almost imperceptibly. "Miss Thornwood, perhaps you might find more success if you were actually present in this classroom rather than somewhere in the vicinity of the Forbidden Forest." Eliza's cheeks burned. "Sorry, Professor." "Concentration is key to transfiguration," McGonagall continued, but her voice lacked its usual sharp edge. "However, I understand that anticipation of new experiences can be distracting. Might I remind you that care of magical creatures, while certainly engaging, requires the same focus and respect as any other subject? Approach it with a clear mind and proper attention, and you'll find yourself quite capable." It was as close to encouragement as Professor McGonagall typically offered, and Eliza felt simultaneously grateful and more nervous. Even the teachers expected her to be capable. What if she wasn't? By the time lunch arrived, Eliza's stomach was too knotted to contemplate eating. She pushed food around her plate, while Lavender and Parvati discussed whether hippogriffs were more beautiful than unicorns, and Dean Thomas argued with Seamus Finnegan about whether anything could be more impressive than dragons. The great hall was full of the usual lunchtime din, scraping cutlery, animated conversations, the occasional spell going slightly wrong and requiring intervention from a prefect. Through it all, Eliza watched the enchanted ceiling. The grey clouds had thickened, and a fine mist was beginning to fall. Not quite rain, but enough to make everything damp and cold. Perfect weather for standing in a paddock with creatures that could kill you if you offended them. "Right then," Marcus said, standing and brushing crumbs from his robes. "Ready?" "No," Eliza said honestly, but she stood anyway. The walk down to Hagrid's hut felt like a march to execution. They joined the stream of third-year Gryffindors making their way out of the castle and across the grounds. Harry, Ron, and Hermione were ahead. Hermione still lecturing Ron about something from one of their textbooks. Neville Longbottom walked alone, looking almost as nervous as Eliza felt, which was oddly comforting. At least she wasn't the only one. The grounds stretched out before them, sloping down toward the Forbidden Forest. The grass was still green despite the autumn chill, dotted here and there with late-blooming wildflowers that shivered in the cool breeze. To their left, the lake spread out like hammered pewter, its surface dimpled by the fine mist rain. Eliza could just make out the gentle ripples that suggested something moving beneath. Probably the giant squid, though merpeople were said to have windows cut into the lake bed, where they watched the castle above. The smell of pumpkins grew stronger as they approached Hagrid's hut, great orange globes sitting in neat rows in the vegetable patch, some already carved with faces for the approaching Halloween feast. Smoke curled from the hut's chimney, and Eliza could see Fang's massive head in the window, the boarhound's breath fogging the glass as he watched them approach. But it was what lay beyond the hut that drew every eye and stilled every conversation: the paddock. Hagrid had constructed it in a clearing at the forest's edge, a large fenced area with posts as thick as young trees. Inside, magnificent creatures moved with casual grace, half eagle, half horse, entirely extraordinary. There were perhaps a dozen of them, their coats ranging from chestnut to grey to pure black, their eagle heads alert and watchful. Even from a distance, Eliza could see the fierce intelligence in their orange eyes, the lethal curve of their steel-grey beaks, the powerful muscles beneath their sleek hides. Hippogriffs. They were bigger than she'd imagined. So much bigger. The largest stood perhaps 8 feet at the shoulder, its wings currently folded, suggesting a wingspan that would eclipse a small cottage. The talons on their front legs gleamed like polished daggers, each one as long as Eliza's hand. They moved with a peculiar grace, the front half moving like a bird, while the back half moved like a horse, and somehow it all worked together in a way that was both beautiful and utterly alien. "Blimey," breathed Seamus Finnegan. "They're massive." The class had reached the edge of the paddock now, clustering together instinctively. The Slytherins were already there, leaning against the fence with varying expressions of disdain, curiosity, and, in Malfoy's case, theatrical wariness. He cradled his slung arm and shot Hagrid a look that promised trouble. Hagrid himself stood near the gate, looking simultaneously proud and terrified. He wore what Eliza suspected was his best coat, which was to say, slightly less patched than usual, and had made an attempt to tame his wild hair and beard. It hadn't worked. He clutched his pink umbrella, which everyone knew concealed the pieces of his broken wand, and shifted his weight from foot to foot like a nervous first year. Right then, his voice boomed across the clearing, making several students jump. Gather round, gather round. Not too close to the fence now. These here are hippogriffs, and they deserve your respect." Eliza found herself pressed between Marcus and Neville at the back of the group. Up close, she could see individual details she'd missed from a distance. The way the hippogriff's feathers caught the grey light and shimmered with hidden colours, bronze and gold and deep purple. The way their ears, horse ears on horse heads, eagle sharp and alert, swiveled to track every sound. The way they watched the gathered students with eyes that seemed to see straight through skin and bone to the trembling soul beneath. One hippogriff in particular drew Eliza's attention. It stood slightly apart from the others, smaller than most, but no less magnificent. Its coat was the colour of storm clouds, that a particular shade of grey-black that promised lightning, and its feathers were so dark they seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Unlike the others, who had settled into a kind of watchful patience, this one shifted restlessly, its wings rustling, its tail flicking with what might have been impatience or nervousness. Eliza wasn't sure which. "Now," Hagrid continued, his voice taking on the particular tone of a teacher who'd rehearsed this speech many times, "the first thing you need to know about hippogriffs is that they're proud, easily offended. Insult one, and it'll be the last thing you do." Several students shifted uncomfortably. Malfoy's mouth twitched into something that might have been a smirk or might have been genuine unease. But Hagrid's face broke into a wide smile. "Show 'em respect, and there's nothing more loyal or noble. They've got intelligence, see? Real intelligence. They understand more than most people give 'em credit for." He moved toward the gate, fumbling with the latch. "Now, I need a volunteer. Someone to demonstrate the proper way to approach a hippogriff. Who wants to go first?" The silence that followed was profound. Not a single hand went up. Even the usual eager students, Hermione, who typically volunteered for everything, remained still. The only sound was the wind rustling through the grass and the occasional rustle of feathers from within the paddock. Hagrid's face fell slightly. His eyes swept the crowd, clearly hoping someone would step forward, would show faith in him and his teaching. His gaze lingered on Harry for a moment, and Eliza saw something pass between them. A history she didn't fully understand, but could recognize as significant. Harry stepped forward. "I'll do it." Relief and pride flooded Hagrid's features. "Good man, Harry. Right, come on then. Up here, where everyone can see." Eliza watched as Harry approached the fence, Ron calling encouragement, while Hermione looked torn between pride and concern. Hagrid opened the gate and selected one of the hippogriffs, a beautiful grey-white specimen that moved with particular grace. He called it Buckbeak, speaking to it with the same gentle affection he might use with Fang. What followed was a masterclass in respect and courage. Hagrid explained every step, the approach slow and steady, the importance of eye contact, showing you weren't prey, and then, crucially, the bow. "Ye bow," Hagrid instructed, his voice carrying across the clearing. "And ye wait. If he bows back, you can touch him. If he doesn't bow back, you get away fast, 'cause that means he don't trust you." Harry bowed. It wasn't a deep bow, but it was deliberate, respectful. He kept his eyes low, his body language submissive in a way that must have cost him something. Harry Potter, the boy who lived, bowing to a creature that could kill him with one swipe of those talons. For a long moment, nothing happened. The world seemed to hold its breath. Even the wind died down. Then Buckbeak's front legs folded, his proud head lowered. He bowed back. The relief in Hagrid's voice was palpable. "Well done, Harry. Well done. Now ye can pat him. Go on, he'll let you." Harry reached out, his hand trembling slightly, or perhaps that was just Eliza's imagination, and touched Buckbeak's neck where the steel grey feathers met the pale hide. The hippogriff made a soft sound, almost like a purr or a coo, and leaned into the touch. Brilliant. Hagrid was beaming now, his earlier nervousness forgotten in his enthusiasm. Absolutely brilliant. Now who else wants to try? This time, several hands went up. The successful demonstration had broken the spell of fear, or at least cracked it. Students began to move forward in ones and twos, Hagrid sorting them out and pairing them with different hippogriffs. Eliza remained rooted to her spot, her heart hammering. She watched as Dean Thomas was paired with a chestnut hippogriff and successfully earned a bow. Watched as Parvati giggled nervously. but managed to touch a dappled grey. Even Neville, white-faced but determined, stepped forward and was guided toward a smaller, gentler-looking specimen. Marcus nudged her gently. "You going to try?" I don't know," Eliza whispered. Her eyes kept returning to the dark-feathered hippogriff standing apart from the others. It hadn't been chosen by any student yet, and no wonder. There was something almost fierce about its isolation, something that suggested it preferred its own company to the attention of nervous teenagers. "That one's called Storm Dancer," Hagrid's voice suddenly said from beside her, making Eliza jump. She hadn't noticed him approach. "He's younger than most of the others. A bit temperamental, like. Prefers to keep to himself." Hagrid studied Eliza with those beetle black eyes that saw more than most people realized. "But he's got a good heart, Storm Dancer does. Just needs someone who'll approach him proper-like. Someone who understands what it's like to be, well, to feel like you don't quite fit where everyone thinks you should." The words hit Eliza like a stunning spell. She looked up at Hagrid, then back at the storm-colored hippogriff. Storm Dancer was watching her now, those amber eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that made her want to look away. But she didn't. "Would you like to try with him?" Hagrid asked gently. "No pressure, mind. Only if you feel ready." Eliza's mouth was dry. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse, to stay safe behind the fence with the students who'd chosen not to volunteer, to be sensible, cautious, careful. But she thought of Marcus's words at breakfast. She thought of McGonagall's subtle encouragement. She thought of 3 years feeling like an imposter in Gryffindor Tower. She thought of Storm Dancer, standing alone, before her courage could fail her completely, before her rational mind could overrule her heart. Eliza heard herself say, "Yes, yes, I'd like to try." Hagrid's face split into a smile that could have lit the darkening sky. "Right then, Miss Thornwood. Come on, let's show him how it's done proper." He opened the gate. Eliza stepped through, and her world narrowed to storm-dark feathers, amber eyes, and the sound of her own heart beating like thunder in her chest. The paddock was larger from the inside. That was Eliza's first thought, as Hagrid closed the gate behind her with a soft click that sounded, to her heightened senses, like the closing of a vault. The fence that had seemed sturdy and protective from the outside now felt flimsy and far away, leaving her exposed in a space that suddenly felt vast as the Quidditch pitch. The ground beneath her feet was soft with fallen leaves and hay that Hagrid had scattered about, meant to cushion hooves and talons, but now muffling her footsteps in a way that made her feel unmoored, disconnected. The smell was overwhelming. Animal musk and hay and something else. Something wild that reminded her of storms and high places and things that humans were never meant to touch. Around her, the hippogriffs moved with casual grace, unbothered by her presence, but aware of it all the same. She could feel their attention like weight on her skin, could see from the corner of her eye how their heads turned to track her movement, how their wings rustled with interest or warning, she couldn't tell which. But mostly, she was aware of Storm Dancer. The hippogriff stood perhaps 20 feet away, and those 20 feet felt simultaneously like miles and inches. He was watching her with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. His amber eyes were nothing like the gentle brown of a horse's eye or the sharp alertness of an eagle's. They were something else entirely, intelligent and measuring and utterly unforgiving of pretense. Now then, Hagrid's voice came from behind her, quiet and encouraging, pitched just for her to hear while the rest of the class watched from beyond the fence. You remember what I showed you? Approach slow and steady. Keep your eyes on him, but don't stare. That's aggressive, see? Let him know you're there, that you're not hiding nothing, but you're not challenging him neither. Eliza nodded, not trusting her voice. Her throat had gone dry as parchment. And breathe, Hagrid added, his tone gentler still. They can sense when you're holding your breath. Makes them nervous. Just breathe natural-like. Natural. Right. As if anything about this situation was natural. But Eliza drew in a breath, shaky and thin, but a breath nonetheless. The autumn air tasted of approaching rain and dead leaves and hippogriff, that wild storm scent that seemed to emanate from Storm Dancer like heat from a fire. She took a step forward. The world narrowed. The voices of her classmates faded to a distant murmur, like waves on a far shore. The grey sky above, the dark line of the forbidden forest behind, even Hagrid's reassuring bulk at her back, all of it receded until there was only Eliza and Storm Dancer and the space between them that she had to cross. Another step. The hay whispered beneath her shoes. Storm Dancer's ears, those horse ears set on his eagle head, swiveled forward, tracking her movement with precise attention. His wings shifted, not spreading but settling, feathers rustling like pages of a book in a library wind. The sound made her think of the restricted section, of dangerous knowledge kept behind barriers for good reason. That's good, Hagrid murmured. Nice and slow. You're doing great. Was she? Eliza didn't feel like she was doing great. She felt like she was walking a tightrope over a chasm, every step a negotiation with gravity and luck. Her hands trembled at her sides. She clenched them into fists, then forced herself to relax them. Tension would show. He would know. 15 feet now. Close enough to see individual feathers, to notice how they weren't just black, but held hidden colors in their depths. Deep indigo, hints of purple, the green-black of a raven's wing. Close enough to see the curve of his beak, sharp as any blade, and to understand in her bones how easily it could tear through flesh and bone if she made one wrong move. Close enough to see the scars. They were subtle, almost invisible against the dark feathers. But they were there. Thin white lines along his neck, a notch missing from one wing. This was not a creature who'd lived a life of ease. He'd fought or fled, or simply survived in ways that left marks. The realization sent a strange pang through Eliza's chest. Not pity. She sensed instinctively that Storm Dancer would find pity insulting, but recognition. She knew what it was like to carry invisible scars, to feel marked by experiences others couldn't see. 10 feet. She could hear him now, the soft sound of his breathing, deeper and slower than a horse's, with an edge that suggested the wind in his lungs was meant for higher altitudes than this muddy paddock. Could see the rise and fall of his chest, the powerful muscles beneath the sleek coat that shifted with his smallest movement. His tail flicked. Horsetail, long and dark. And Eliza froze. Was that annoyance? Anticipation? She had no idea. 3 years of theory in care of magical creatures, before Hagrid took over, when they'd studied flobberworms and gnomes and other things that couldn't kill you with a casual gesture, hadn't prepared her for this. All those hours reading about magical creatures in books, looking at illustrations and memorizing facts, and none of it, none of it had captured what it actually felt like to stand before one. "Easy," Hagrid said, though Eliza wasn't sure if he was talking to her or to Stormdancer. "He's just taking your measure, deciding what he thinks of you. That's good. Means he's paying attention. Means he's considering you." 5 feet now, and Eliza stopped. This felt close enough. Any closer, and she'd be within reach of those talons, that beak. Within striking distance if he decided she'd offended him somehow, if her approach had been wrong, if the way she held her shoulders or the smell of her fear or any of 1,000 things she couldn't control had failed his test. For a long moment, they simply stood there, girl and Hippogriff, watching each other across 5 feet of space that felt like the gap between worlds. Up close, Stormdancer was breathtaking in a way that had nothing to do with beauty and everything to do with presence. He was real in a way that books and lessons could never capture. Solid and warm and alive, every inch of him designed by magic and nature for purposes Eliza could barely comprehend. Flying, hunting, surviving, being free in ways that humans, bound by gravity and convention, could never truly be. His eyes held hers, and Eliza felt the weight of that gaze like a physical thing. He was reading her, she realized. Not her words, she hadn't spoken, was barely breathing, but something deeper. The truth of her, whatever that meant. The intention beneath the fear, the respect beneath the trembling. Behind her, someone whispered. She thought it might be Lavender, and Stormdancer's head turned sharply toward the sound. His wings spread slightly, a clear warning, and several students gasped. Eliza's heart leaped into her throat. "Quiet, all of you." Hagrid's voice cracked like a whip, uncharacteristically sharp. "He's concentrating. You got to let him work this out in his own time." The class fell silent. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Stormdancer's attention returned to Eliza. His wings settled back against his flanks, but his posture remained alert, watchful. She could see now how his weight was balanced on his rear hooves, ready to rear up if needed. Could see the tension in his shoulders, in the powerful chest muscles that would drive those wings through the air. He was magnificent and terrifying. And Eliza realized with sudden crystalline clarity that she was about to bow to him, to bend at the waist, to lower her eyes, to make herself vulnerable in every way that mattered, and trust that he would not strike. "Now," Hagrid said softly, "when you're ready, not before, you bow. Remember, it's not a nod, it's a proper bow, and you hold it till he responds one way or t'other. Can you do that?" Could she? Eliza's legs felt like water. Her hands were shaking so badly she clasped them together in front of her, hoping it looked like respect rather than terror. Her breath came quick and shallow, despite Hagrid's advice to breathe naturally. But beneath the fear, something else stirred, something that felt almost like curiosity, wonder. She'd read about hippogriffs her entire magical education, had seen illustrations, had memorized their classification, XXX, only dangerous if provoked, had written essays about their breeding habits and diet. But she'd never imagined standing before one, never truly understood what they were. Now she did. And despite everything, despite her terror and doubt and the voice in her head screaming at her to step back, to return to safety, she wanted this, wanted to complete this connection, this ancient ritual of respect between human and creature, wanted to prove to herself and perhaps to Stormdancer that she could be brave in the way that actually mattered. Not loud bravery, not charging into danger bravery, but the quiet courage of vulnerability, of trusting someone, something else not to hurt you when you gave them the chance. Eliza drew in a breath, held it, let it out slowly. Then she bowed. It wasn't graceful. She was too stiff with tension, too aware of every movement. But she bent at the waist, keeping her legs straight, and lowered her head until her eyes were fixed on the ground, on the hay and mud and scattered leaves at Stormdancer's talons. Talons that could disembowel her with one strike. She couldn't help but think, even as she tried to push the thought away. The vulnerability was excruciating. Every instinct screamed at her to look up, to watch Stormdancer, to see what he was doing. Not being able to see him felt like standing on the edge of a precipice with her eyes closed. Anything could happen. He could rear up, could strike with beak or talons, could stop, breathe, trust. The position hurt. Not physically, though her back muscles were already protesting, but emotionally. This was everything she wasn't. Exposed, vulnerable, completely at someone else's mercy. This was the opposite of the careful walls she'd built around herself, the quiet invisibility she'd perfected over 3 years at Hogwarts. This was being seen. Time stretched. Seconds felt like hours. Eliza's breathing was loud in her own ears, her heartbeat a drum that surely everyone could hear. The class had gone utterly silent. Even the other Hippogriffs seemed to have stilled, watching this moment between girl and Stormdancer with the attention it deserved. How long had she been bowing? Too long. Not long enough. What if Stormdancer never responded? What if he decided she wasn't worth his acknowledgement and simply turned away? Or worse, what if a sound? It was subtle, the soft thud of weight shifting, the whisper of feathers adjusting. Eliza's breath caught. She wanted desperately to look up, to see what was happening, but Hagrid's instructions echoed in her mind. Hold the bow until he responds. Don't look up early. That would be presumptuous, disrespectful. Another sound, closer, the soft compression of hay beneath hooves. He was moving, toward her or away. Eliza couldn't tell, couldn't see anything but the ground and her own hands clasped before her, knuckles white with tension. Then, so close it made her jump, a breath, warm and smelling of grass and sky and wild things. Stormdancer's breath washing over her bowed head, ruffling her hair. He was right there, right in front of her, close enough to touch if she dared reach out, close enough to kill her if he chose. The moment stretched into eternity. Eliza held herself perfectly still, barely breathing, waiting for something, approval or rejection. Life or death, her terrified mind supplied, though she tried to dismiss that as dramatic. And then she heard it, felt it, really, transmitted through the ground and the air and some sixth sense she hadn't known she possessed. The hollow thud of Stormdancer's front legs folding, the rustle of feathers as his proud head lowered. He was bowing back. The relief that flooded through Eliza was so intense it nearly knocked her over. Her legs went weak, her vision swam, and for a moment she thought she might actually faint right there in the paddock in front of everyone. But she locked her knees and straightened slowly, carefully, not making any sudden movements that might startle him, and found herself looking directly into Stormdancer's eyes. This close, they were extraordinary. Not just amber, but faceted like gems, holding depths and colors that shifted with the light. Ancient eyes, she thought, though Hagrid had said he was young. But there was something in that gaze that seemed to know things about wind and sky and freedom that Eliza could never fully understand. He was beautiful, not in the way of pretty things, but in the way of storms and mountains and the forbidden forest at midnight. Beautiful in their power, their wildness, their complete and utter indifference to human ideas of beauty. "Well done." Hagrid's voice was thick with emotion. "Well done, Miss Thornwood. That were perfect, that was. Textbook perfect. Now, if you like, and only if you want to, you can touch him. Slow, mind. Let him see your hand coming. Touch him." Eliza's mouth went dry all over again. Bowing was one thing. It was ritual, formal, with clear rules and boundaries. But touching, that was intimate. That was crossing from respect into something like connection. Her hand trembled as she lifted it. Stormdancer's eyes tracked the movement, his head tilting slightly. Curious, perhaps, or simply watchful. She moved slowly, so slowly, giving him every chance to pull back or strike if he chose. Her fingertips brushed feathers. The texture shocked her. She'd expected them to be soft, like the feathers from her quill pens, but these were different, sleek and almost oily, designed to shed water and cut through wind. They were warm too, warmer than she'd anticipated, radiating the heat of the living body beneath. Stormdancer made a sound, a soft clicking deep in his throat that might have been approval or simple acknowledgement. He didn't pull away. Emboldened, Eliza let her palm rest more fully against his neck, where the steel grey feathers met the dark horsehide in a sharp, precise line. The transition was jarring, from the slick smoothness of feathers to the coarse, wiry texture of horsecoat. She could feel his pulse beneath her hand, strong and steady, beating out a rhythm that was both alien and familiar. "He likes you," Hagrid said, and Eliza could hear the smile in his voice. "See how he's leaning in? That's trust, that is. He's deciding you're all right." Trust. The word resonated in Eliza's chest like a bell. Stormdancer was trusting her, this proud, fierce creature who'd bowed to no one until she'd shown him proper respect. He was letting her touch him, stand close to him, exist in his space without threat or fear. When was the last time Eliza had trusted like that? When was the last time she'd let anyone close enough to really see her, without all her careful walls and quiet defenses? "Now," Hagrid continued, his voice taking on that teacher tone again, projecting so the whole class could hear. "Who else wants to give it a try? Come on, don't be shy. The Hippogriffs won't hurt you if you show 'em proper respect." There was a shuffling beyond the fence as more students moved forward, their fear overcome by watching Eliza's success. She heard Hermione's voice directing Ron toward a dappled mare, heard Seamus making jokes to cover his nervousness as he approached a chestnut stallion. But Eliza barely registered any of it. She was lost in the moment, in the warmth of Stormdancer's neck beneath her palm, in the steady rise and fall of his breathing, in the amber eyes that watched her with something that might have been approval or might simply have been patience. "Yeah, did brilliant," Hagrid said quietly, just for her. Not many students get it right the first time. Most are too eager or too scared or too something. But you approached him just right, like you understood what he needed. "I was terrified," Eliza admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know," Hagrid said. He knew it too. "But ye did it anyway, didn't you? That's what bravery is really. Not the absence of fear, but doing what needs doing despite it. It was almost exactly what Marcus had said, and what McGonagall had implied. Maybe they were right. Maybe courage wasn't what she'd always thought, wasn't loud and flashy and bold. Maybe it was this, standing in a paddock with shaking hands and a racing heart, choosing to bow anyway. Would you? Hagrid hesitated, then continued with a kind of eager hope that reminded Eliza of Fang begging for scraps at dinner. Would you like to try riding him? Flying, I mean. He seems to have taken to you, and it's the most amazing feeling in the world. It is. But only if you're comfortable. No pressure. Flying. The word hit Eliza like a stunning spell. She'd watched Harry fly on Buckbeak earlier, watched him soar over the paddock with a whoop of exhilaration that had made the class cheer. It had looked terrifying and wonderful in equal measure. The ground falling away, nothing but air and trust between you and a very long fall. Every rational part of her mind screamed no. She'd done enough, proved enough. She'd approached the Hippogriff and earned his bow and touched him. That was already more than she'd thought possible when she'd woken up this morning. So ask for more, to push her luck. But Stormdancer was watching her with those eyes that seemed to see everything. And beneath her hand, she could feel the powerful muscles of his shoulders, could imagine them driving those magnificent wings through the air, could imagine what it might feel like to leave the ground, to be carried by this creature who'd chosen to trust her back. When would she get another chance like this? When would she ever again stand on the edge of something so terrifying and so wonderful, with the choice entirely her own? From the fence, she heard Marcus's voice calling encouragement, saw Hagrid's hopeful expression, his desperate desire for his lesson to succeed, for his students to understand the wonder of the creatures he loved, saw Stormdancer, patient and waiting, ready to accept whatever she chose. And Eliza realized something that struck her with the force of revelation. This wasn't about proving herself to her house or living up to expectations or being the kind of Gryffindor everyone thought she should be. This was about this moment, this choice, this creature before her who'd bowed to her respect and offered his own in return. This was about trust. Eliza took a breath that tasted of autumn and Hippogriff and possibility. Yes, she said, her voice stronger than she'd expected. Yes, I'd like to fly. Hagrid's face split into a grin that could have lit the darkening sky. Right then, let's get you mounted up. This is going to be brilliant. And as Eliza prepared to climb onto Stormdancer's back, as her classmates gathered closer to watch, as the grey clouds above promised rain that hadn't yet fallen, she felt something shift inside her chest. Not confidence, exactly, not fearlessness, but maybe, just maybe, the beginning of understanding what it meant to be brave. Mounting a hippogriff, Eliza discovered, was nothing like the theory suggested. In the Monster Book of Monsters, now safely closed and docile in her dormitory, there had been a simple line drawing showing the proper positioning. One hand gripping the feathers at the base of the neck, one foot finding purchase against the folded wing joint, a swift pull upward. The illustration made it look graceful, easy, as if hippogriffs were merely horses with inconvenient wings attached. The reality was far more complicated. Right then, Hagrid said, positioning himself beside Stormdancer's shoulder. Yeah, want to approach from his left side? That's traditional like. though some hippogriffs don't mind either way. Put your hand here, see? He indicated a spot where the dark feathers grew thick at the base of Stormdancer's neck. Get a good grip. Don't worry about pulling. Their feathers are stronger than they look. Then your foot goes here against the wing joint and you pull yourself up. I'll give you a boost if you need it. Eliza nodded, her mouth too dry for words. Up close, Stormdancer seemed even larger than before. His back was easily 5 feet off the ground, higher than her head, and the muscles beneath his hide shifted with each breath, reminding her that this was a living creature, not some conjured mount that would obey her commands. She reached up, her fingers tangling in the feathers Hagrid had indicated. They were coarser than they looked, almost wire-like in their strength. Stormdancer's head turned slightly, one amber eye fixing on her, and she froze. "It's all right," Hagrid said gently. "He's just making sure you're not doing anything daft. Keep moving. He'll let you know if he doesn't like something. Keep moving." Right. Eliza found the wing joint with her foot. It was higher than she'd expected, required her to stretch in a way that felt precarious and ungainly. For a moment she simply hung there, one hand gripping feathers, one foot braced against warm hide and bone, feeling foolish and terrified in equal measure. Up you go! Hagrid's massive hand pressed against her back, giving her the boost she needed. Eliza scrambled up with none of the grace the illustration had promised, her knee banging against Stormdancer's shoulder, her other foot flailing for purchase. For one horrible moment, she thought she'd slide right off the other side, but then she found her balance and was suddenly sitting astride the Hippogriff's back, her legs dangling on either side of his powerful body. The world looked different from up here. That was her first coherent thought. She'd gained perhaps 5 feet of height, but it changed everything. The paddock spread out around her, the other hippogriffs looking smaller despite their size. Beyond the fence, her classmates' faces were upturned, some excited, some envious, some, like Malfoy, distinctly skeptical. The castle rose in the distance, its towers and turrets grey against the darker grey of the clouds, and for a moment Eliza felt a strange sense of displacement, as if she'd stepped out of her normal life into something else entirely. Then Stormdancer shifted beneath her, and she grabbed frantically at his feathers, her moment of wonder replaced by immediate panic. "Easy," Hagrid called. "He's just adjusting to your weight. Get a good grip on his feathers. Both hands. That's it. You want to hold on tight once you're in the air, but not so tight he thinks you're scared. Confident-like. Firm, but not strangling. Confident, but not scared. Firm, but not strangling." Eliza's mind spun, trying to pass the contradictions. How was she supposed to hold on for dear life while appearing calm? How did one grip firmly without revealing the absolute terror coursing through every nerve? "Now," Hagrid continued, moving to stand before Stormdancer, where the hippogriff could see him clearly. "When you're ready, and only when you're ready, I'm going to step back. He'll know that's his cue to move. He'll probably start with a walk, maybe a trot, to get used to carrying you. Then, if he feels like it, he'll take off. You don't control that bit. Hippogriffs fly when they want to fly. You're just along for the ride. Just along for the ride, on a creature that could decide at any moment to soar into the sky, with nothing but her grip on his feathers between her and a fatal fall." "I don't," Eliza started, but her voice came out as a squeak. She tried again. "I don't know if I can do this." Hagrid's expression softened. Around them, the paddock had grown quiet. Even the students who'd been working with other hippogriffs had stopped to watch. Eliza could feel their eyes on her, could sense their expectations. The shy Gryffindor who'd surprised everyone by approaching Stormdancer was now going to fly. It would be a story they'd tell, either of her success or her failure. "You don't have to," Hagrid said, and the kindness in his voice nearly broke her. "No one's forcing you. You've already done amazing, better than most. If you want to get down, that's fine, really." He meant it too. Eliza could see it in his face. There would be no judgment, no disappointment that mattered. She could climb down, return to the fence, tell herself that approaching and touching a hippogriff was enough for one day. But Stormdancer's head had turned, and he was watching her over his shoulder with those amber eyes. There was no impatience in his gaze, no frustration, just waiting, patient and still, willing to carry her or not, whichever she chose. And Eliza realized that climbing down now would feel like a betrayal. Not of her classmates' expectations or Hagrid's hopes, but of something between her and this creature. He'd bowed to her. He'd let her touch him. He'd allowed her to climb onto his back, accepting her weight and presence without complaint. He'd trusted her. Now it was her turn to trust him. "No," Eliza said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "No, I want to try." Hagrid's grin could have rivaled the sun. "That's the spirit. Right then, hold on tight. Remember, lean forward when he takes off. Lean with him. Don't fight his movements. Just go with them. Like dancing, sort of. Dancing. With a hippogriff. In the air." Before Eliza could reconsider, Hagrid stepped back. For a moment, nothing happened. Stormdancer stood perfectly still, and Eliza wondered if perhaps he'd changed his mind, if he'd decided she wasn't worth the effort after all. Then she felt it, the subtle shift of muscle beneath her, the gathering of power like a drawn bowstring. He took a step forward, then another. The motion was strange, not the smooth gait of a horse, but something more complex. The front half moved like a bird, each talon placement deliberate and precise. The back half moved like a horse, hooves striking the ground with hollow thuds. Somehow her body had to absorb both rhythms at once, and Eliza felt like she was riding two different creatures that just happened to share the same spine. "That's it," Hagrid called. "You're doing great." Stormdancer's walk transitioned into a trot, and Eliza bit back a gasp. The movement was jarring, bouncing her with each stride, and she gripped his feathers tighter, her knuckles white. The paddock blurred around her. Fence posts, watching faces, other hippogriffs turning their heads to observe. She was dimly aware of students calling encouragement, of Marcus's voice rising above the others, but it all seemed distant, muffled. Then Stormdancer began to run. The transition was so sudden, Eliza nearly lost her seat. One moment they were trotting, uncomfortable but manageable, and the next, his powerful hindquarters bunched and released, driving them forward at a speed that stole her breath. The wind hit her face, cold and sharp, bringing tears to her eyes. His wings began to spread, slowly at first, then wider, until they blotted out the grey sky on either side. The ground rushed beneath them. Fence posts flew past. They were approaching the far end of the paddock, the barrier beyond which lay the sloping lawns and the distant lake. Surely he would turn, would circle back. Surely he wouldn't. The ground fell away. Eliza's stomach lurched into her throat as Stormdancer's wings beat down once, twice, powerful strokes that lifted them into the air. For one infinite, terrible moment, she was falling and flying simultaneously, her body confused about which direction was up. The horizon tilted, the world spun, and she pressed herself flat against Stormdancer's neck, her face buried in his feathers, her eyes squeezed shut because she couldn't look down, couldn't acknowledge the emptiness beneath them. Lean forward, Hagrid's voice, distant now, barely audible over the wind. Don't fight him. Go with it. Go with it. As if she had any choice, as if she was in control of anything that was happening. But some instinct, maybe the same instinct that had made her approach Stormdancer in the first place, made her lift her head slightly, made her open her eyes, and the world exploded into wonder. They were flying, actually, impossibly flying. The paddock spread out below them, small and contained, the fence barely visible. The students were dots, their upturned faces pale blurs. Hagrid was a massive shape beside the gate, waving enthusiastically. Beyond the paddock, the grounds of Hogwarts rolled away in autumn glory. The lake a sheet of hammered pewter, the forbidden forest a dark blanket of green and gold, the castle rising like something from a storybook, all towers and turrets and impossible angles. And beneath her, Stormdancer's wings beat with steady rhythm, each stroke powerful and sure. She could feel the muscles working, could sense the way he adjusted for air currents she couldn't see. He knew what he was doing. This was his element, his natural state. He was flying not because Hagrid had commanded it, or because the lesson required it, but because this was what hippogriffs did. This was what he was. The fear didn't disappear. It couldn't, not entirely, not when nothing but her grip stood between her and a fatal plunge. But it changed, transformed into something more complex, something shot through with exhilaration and awe and a kind of joy she'd never experienced before. They climbed higher. The castle came into clearer view. Individual windows, courtyards, the covered bridge connecting two towers. Eliza could see students in some of the windows, tiny figures pointing up at them. Could see nearly headless Nick drifting through a wall, his pearly form visible even from this distance. Could see the Quidditch pitch, empty now, but waiting for the weekend matches that drew the whole school. Stormdancer banked left, and Eliza's heart leaped as the world tilted. For a moment, they were flying sideways, the castle horizontal, the lake vertical. Her grip tightened convulsively on his feathers, her legs clamping around his body. But he was in control, always in control, and the maneuver was smooth, graceful, ending with them flying level again, but in a new direction. Below them now, the lake. From the air, Eliza could see things she'd never noticed from the ground. The way the shallow parts near the shore were lighter, greenish, while the depths were almost black. The occasional ripple that suggested something large moving beneath the surface, the giant squid, perhaps, or the merpeople in their underwater village. A small dock she'd never noticed, probably used by the groundskeeper for the boats that carried first years across at the start of term. The wind was fierce up here, pulling at her robes, tangling her hair, bringing tears that streamed back toward her temples. It smelled different than ground-level air, cleaner somehow, wilder, tasting of clouds and distance. Eliza realized she was breathing in great gulps of it, filling her lungs with sky. Stormdancer called out, a sound halfway between an eagle's shriek and a horse's whinny, triumphant and free. The sound resonated through his body, through Eliza's body where she pressed against him, and without thinking, she found herself laughing. Actual laughter, bright and surprised, ripped from her by the sheer impossibility of what she was doing. She was flying. Shy, quiet Eliza Thornwood, who couldn't manage a Patronus charm and still struggled with summoning spells, and had spent 3 years feeling like an imposter in her own house. She was flying on the back of a hippogriff, over the grounds of Hogwarts, with the autumn wind in her face and nothing but sky above. They circled wider now, Stormdancer's confidence in his rider apparently growing. They flew over the forbidden forest, close enough that Eliza could see individual trees, the thick canopy of leaves gold and red and still green. Something large moved in a clearing, a herd of thestrals, their skeletal forms visible to her now that she'd seen Death, her grandmother, 2 summers ago, peaceful in her sleep, but Death nonetheless. They raised their dragon-like heads to watch the hippogriff pass, then returned to whatever they'd been doing. Farther out, she could see the mountains, distant and purple with haze, their peaks lost in low clouds. Hagrid had mentioned once that there were dragons in those mountains, or had been, wild and fierce and avoiding human contact. The thought should have terrified her, but up here, flying through the same sky those dragons flew, it seemed almost natural. Magic was real after all. She'd always known that in an abstract way, had learned it and studied it and practiced it with her wand. But this was magic in its purest form, not spells or potions or incantations, but the simple, profound magic of flight. Stormdancer began to descend, his circles tightening, bringing them back toward the paddock. Eliza felt a pang of something like grief. Already, it seemed like they'd only been up for moments, though some rational part of her mind suggested it had been longer. Time worked differently in the air, apparently. Or maybe fear and joy together did something to perception, stretched it or compressed it until minutes felt like hours or hours felt like seconds. The ground rose to meet them, first distant, then closer, then suddenly near enough that Eliza could make out individual faces again. The students were cheering, she realized. Even some of the Slytherins looked impressed, though Malfoy's expression remained sour. Hagrid was beaming, practically bouncing with excitement. "Brace yourself," Hagrid called as they descended. "The landing can be a bit rough." Rough was an understatement. Stormdancer's hooves hit the ground with a jarring impact that rattled Eliza's teeth and nearly threw her forward over his neck. His talons dug into the soft earth, wings still spread wide for balance, and they skidded several feet before coming to a complete stop. For a moment, Eliza just sat there, breathing hard, her hands still locked in Stormdancer's feathers. Her legs were shaking. She could feel the tremors running through her muscles. Her face felt frozen from the wind, and she suspected her hair looked like she'd been struck by lightning. Every part of her body ached from gripping so tightly. She'd never felt more alive. "That was brilliant!" Hagrid was beside them in seconds, his face split in a grin so wide it threatened to meet behind his ears. "Absolutely brilliant. Best first flight I've seen in years. How do you feel?" How did she feel? Eliza tried to find words, but they all seemed inadequate. Terrified? Yes. Exhilarated? Absolutely. Changed? That seemed dramatic, but also somehow true. She started. then stopped. Then, surprising herself, she laughed, a real laugh, bright and unguarded. That was amazing. Down you come then, Hagrid said, offering a hand to help her dismount. Careful now. Your legs might be a bit wobbly. Wobbly was an understatement. When Eliza's feet hit the ground, her knees immediately buckled. Hagrid caught her easily, steadying her until she found her balance. Everything felt strange. Too solid, too still. The ground that had seemed perfectly normal this morning now felt foreign after the freedom of flight. She turned to Storm Dancer, who was watching her with those amber eyes. Up in the air, she'd felt connected to him, their bodies moving together with the wind. Now standing beside him on solid ground, the separation felt wrong somehow. She reached out, placing her palm against his neck one more time. "Thank you," she whispered, too quiet for anyone but the Hippogriff to hear. Storm Dancer lowered his head, not quite a bow, but an acknowledgement. Then he turned and walked away, back toward the other Hippogriffs who'd been watching the display. His wings folded against his sides, his tail swished once, and just like that, he was simply one creature among many, no longer her partner in flight, but his own being, returning to his own concerns. "Miss Thornwood," Professor McGonagall's voice cut through the chattering of students. Eliza turned to find the Transfiguration Professor standing just outside the paddock fence, her tartan robes unmistakable, her expression stern, but her eyes holding something that might have been approval. "A word, if you please." Eliza's stomach sank. Had she done something wrong? Broken some rule? She made her way to the fence on still shaky legs, aware of her classmates watching with renewed interest. McGonagall waited until Eliza was close before speaking, her voice pitched low enough that only Eliza could hear. "That was well done, Miss Thornwood. Very well done indeed." Eliza blinked. Thank you, Professor." "Courage," McGonagall said, and there was something almost gentle in her usually stern features. "Takes many forms. Some are obvious. Dueling dark wizards, defending one's friends, standing up to injustice. Others are quieter, facing one's fears, choosing vulnerability over safety, trusting when every instinct screams to run." She paused, and when she continued, her voice was even softer. "The Sorting Hat does not make mistakes, Miss Thornwood. Perhaps it's time you trusted its judgment as much as that Hippogriff just trusted yours." Before Eliza could respond, McGonagall had turned and was striding back toward the castle, her robes billowing behind her in the wind. Eliza stood there, stunned, McGonagall's words echoing in her mind. "The Sorting Hat does not make mistakes." "Eliza!" Marcus's voice broke through her reverie. He was grinning ear to ear, pushing through the crowd of students. "That was incredible. You were flying. Actually flying." Other voices joined in, Lavender gushing about how romantic it looked, Parvati asking if she'd been scared, even Dean Thomas offering a respectful nod. Neville appeared at her elbow, his round face bright with admiration. "I can't believe you did that," he said quietly. "I couldn't even get mine to bow. You were so brave." Brave. There was that word again. But this time, hearing it, Eliza didn't immediately want to protest or explain it away. Because maybe, just maybe, they were right. Maybe bravery wasn't about being fearless. Maybe it was about being afraid and doing it anyway, about standing in a paddock with shaking hands and choosing to bow, about climbing onto a creature's back and trusting it to carry you into the sky. Maybe the Sorting Hat had seen something in her that she was only now beginning to see in herself. As Hagrid called the class back to attention, as other students took their turns with the Hippogriffs, Eliza found her eyes drifting back to Stormdancer. He stood with the other creatures, grooming his feathers with his beak, apparently unconcerned with the monumental thing they'd just done together. But when she looked at him, really looked, she could still feel the echo of flight in her muscles, could still taste the sky on her tongue, could still remember the moment when fear had transformed into something else entirely, something that felt suspiciously like joy. The grey clouds above finally opened, releasing the rain they'd been threatening all day. Students squealed and ran for cover, but Eliza stood still for a moment, letting the cold drops hit her face, mix with the wind tears already there. She was soaked, she was exhausted. Her legs were still trembling, and her hands were cramping from gripping feathers too tightly, and she had never, in her entire life, felt more like she belonged exactly where she was. The rain intensified as Hagrid finally dismissed the class, fat droplets drumming against the paddock fence and turning the hay-strewn ground into fragrant mud. Students scattered toward the castle, robes pulled over their heads, their voices bright with excitement as they rehashed the lesson. Eliza heard snatches of conversation. "Did you see her face? And I can't believe she actually flew. And wait until we tell everyone at dinner." But they seemed to come from very far away, muffled by the lingering echo of wind in her ears. She walked slowly, apart from the rushing crowd, Marcus at her side, but mercifully quiet. Her legs still felt strange, as if they'd forgotten their purpose after those minutes of dangling useless in the air. Her hands ached where she'd gripped Stormdancer's feathers, her palms bearing faint red marks that would probably darken to bruises by evening. Everything hurt in that peculiar way that spoke of muscles used in unfamiliar ways, of a body pushed beyond its comfortable boundaries. But beneath the physical discomfort, something else hummed, a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with the memory of sky beneath her, of trust given and returned. "You know," Marcus said eventually, as they climbed the stone steps toward the entrance hall, "I don't think I've ever seen you smile like that." Eliza touched her face, surprised to find that she was indeed smiling. When had that started? During the flight? After McGonagall's words? She couldn't pinpoint the moment, which somehow made it more significant. The smile wasn't forced or performed for anyone's benefit. It was simply there, natural as breathing. "I didn't think I could do it," she admitted quietly. Around them, students streamed past in both directions, some heading for their common rooms to change out of wet robes, others making for the Great Hall where early dinner preparations were probably underway. Even when I was up there, flying, part of me couldn't believe it was actually happening. "But you did it anyway." Marcus bumped her shoulder gently with his. "That's what makes it brave, Eliza. Not the doing of easy things, but the doing of hard things anyway." They parted ways at the marble staircase, Marcus heading down toward the Hufflepuff common room in the basement, Eliza climbing up toward Gryffindor Tower. The castle felt different somehow, though nothing had physically changed. The same stone corridors, the same moving staircases, the same portraits gossiping in their frames. But Eliza moved through it with a new awareness, a sense of belonging that had been missing before. Or perhaps it had always been there, and she simply hadn't recognized it. The fat lady was dozing in her portrait when Eliza arrived, her pink silk dress rumpled, an empty wine goblet dangling from her fingers. She startled awake at Eliza's approach, nearly dropping the goblet. "Password?" she asked blearily, then focused more clearly on Eliza's face. "Good heavens, child, you look like you've been through a hurricane, and you're soaking wet. Get inside before you catch your death." "Fortuna, Major," Eliza said, and the portrait swung open. The common room was relatively empty. Most students were still at their afternoon lessons, or wandering the grounds despite the rain. A few seventh years occupied the chairs near the fireplace, their heads bent over what looked like NEWT-level potions work. A second year sat in the corner, methodically practicing wand movements while muttering incantations under his breath. Eliza made her way to the spiral staircase leading to the girls' dormitories, her wet shoes squeaking on the stone. She needed to change, to get warm and dry. But part of her wanted to preserve this moment, the rain-soaked proof of what she'd done, the physical evidence that it had been real and not some elaborate daydream. The dormitory was blessedly empty. Lavender and Parvati were probably still gossiping about the lesson somewhere, and Hermione was undoubtedly in the library. Eliza peeled off her wet robes, hanging them carefully by the window where they'd dry, and changed into a clean uniform. Her hands were still shaking slightly, not from cold but from something else, some residual energy that hadn't dissipated. She sat on her bed, drawing her knees up to her chest, and for the first time since landing, allowed herself to really think about what had happened. She had flown, not on a broomstick, which she'd always found terrifying during first-year flying lessons, not in some theoretical, abstract way, but actually flown, carried through the air by a living creature who'd chosen to bear her weight, who trusted her enough to share the sky. The memory played through her mind in vivid detail. The moment of takeoff, when the ground fell away and her stomach lurched. The terrible, wonderful seconds of climbing, Storm Dancer's wings beating with steady power. The view from above, the castle and grounds spread out like a living map, beautiful in ways she'd never appreciated from the ground. And the feeling. Oh, the feeling. For those brief minutes, she hadn't been shy, Eliza Thornwood, the Gryffindor who didn't quite fit. She hadn't been the girl who sat in the back of classes, who spoke in whispers, who felt like an imposter in her own house. She'd been free, unburdened by expectation or self-doubt or the weight of trying to be something she wasn't. She'd just been herself, and it had been enough. A knock at the door startled her from her reverie. Before she could respond, it swung open to reveal Hermione Granger, her arms full of books as usual, her bushy hair even wilder than normal from the rain. "Oh, Eliza, you're here." Hermione's expression brightened. "I heard about what happened in Care of Magical Creatures. Everyone's talking about it. Apparently, you flew on one of the Hippogriffs. A student in the library said you were brilliant." Eliza felt heat rise to her cheeks. It wasn't that special. Harry flew too, and probably others. Harry's been flying on broomsticks since first year and faced a dragon last year in the first task. Hermione interrupted, setting her books down on her own bed with a decisive thump. "You'd never been on a hippogriff before today. That's different. That's—" She paused, searching for the right word. Impressive. Coming from Hermione, who'd faced trolls and time-turners, and Merlin knew what else alongside Harry and Ron. The compliment felt significant, Eliza didn't quite know what to do with it. I was terrified the entire time, she admitted. Good, Hermione said firmly, pulling off her own wet outer robes. Fear is healthy. It's what keeps us from doing genuinely stupid things. The trick is not letting it stop you from doing brave things. She paused, then added more softly. I'm scared most of the time, you know, when Harry and Ron and I are dealing with things. People think because we keep doing it that we're not frightened. But that's not true. We're just frightened and doing it anyway. Eliza stared at Hermione. Confident, brilliant Hermione, who always seemed to have the right answer, who walked through the castle with her head high, despite the whispers about her muggle-born status. The idea that she was scared, regularly scared, seemed impossible, but also, somehow, comforting. How do you do it? Eliza asked. Keep going when you're scared. Hermione sat on her bed, considering the question with the same seriousness she'd applied to a transfiguration problem. I suppose. I think about why I'm doing it. It's not about being brave for bravery's sake. It's about the thing on the other side of the fear, the friend who needs help, or the mystery that needs solving, or the injustice that needs fighting. The fear is just something you have to walk through to get to what matters. What mattered? For Eliza, what had mattered was, what? Proving herself, earning Stormdancer's trust, understanding what it meant to be Gryffindor? All of those, perhaps, and none of them, exactly. What had mattered, she realized, was the connection. That moment when she and Stormdancer had looked at each other, really looked, and something had passed between them. Recognition, maybe. Two creatures who didn't quite fit where everyone expected them to, choosing to trust each other anyway. Thank you, Eliza said quietly, for saying that. Hermione smiled. A real smile, not the tight, defensive expression she sometimes wore when dealing with Slytherins or skeptical professors. We're housemates. We should support each other. She paused, then added with a hint of mischief, besides, wait until Ron hears. He's been complaining all year that care of magical creatures is too dangerous. And here you are flying on your first lesson. He'll be insufferable. Despite herself, Eliza laughed. The sound surprised her. 2 genuine laughs in one day felt like some kind of record. The dormitory door burst open again, and this time, Lavender and Parvati tumbled through, both talking at once, their words overlapping in an incomprehensible rush. Can't believe you didn't tell us you were going to. Seamus said you looked like a natural, like you'd been doing it for. Even Malfoy looked impressed, though he'd never admit, have to tell us everything, every single detail. They descended on Eliza's bed like a matched pair of excited owls, their eyes bright with curiosity and genuine enthusiasm. Lavender grabbed Eliza's hand, examining the red marks on her palm from gripping feathers. These are going to bruise, she said with satisfaction. Battle scars from hippogriff riding. That's so much better than boring potions burns. What was it like? Parvati demanded, settling cross-legged on the foot of Eliza's bed. Was it terrifying? It looked terrifying from the ground. Dean said you screamed, but Seamus said you were laughing. Both maybe, Eliza said, overwhelmed by their attention, but also, strangely, not minding it as much as she usually did. It was the most frightening thing I've ever done, but also the most amazing. Start from the beginning, Lavender insisted. When Hagrid asked for volunteers, what were you thinking? What had she been thinking? Eliza tried to remember that moment, standing at the fence, watching Harry bow to Buckbeak, feeling the weight of expectation and fear. I was thinking I couldn't do it, she admitted, that I'd freeze or mess up or prove that I didn't belong in Gryffindor after all. But you did do it, Parvati pointed out. So what changed? Eliza thought about Stormdancer, standing apart from the other hippogriffs, about Hagrid's gentle observation that he needed someone who understood what it felt like not to fit, about the moment of choice, to walk through the gate or retreat to safety. I stopped thinking about what I couldn't do, she said slowly, working through the realization even as she spoke it, and started thinking about what I wanted to do. And I wanted to try, to see if I could connect with him, with Stormdancer. That's his name? Lavender sighed dreamily. That's so romantic. A storm-colored hippogriff named Stormdancer, and the shy girl who was brave enough to fly with him. It's not romantic, Eliza protested, though she was smiling. It's just, it happened. The best things just happen, Parvati said sagely, in the tone she used when quoting her mother's wisdom. You can't plan courage. You just have to find it when you need it. They peppered her with more questions. What did his feathers feel like? How fast did he fly? Could she see the mountains? Was she scared she'd fall? And Eliza answered as best she could, surprised to find that talking about it didn't diminish the experience, but somehow enhanced it. Sharing it made it more real, gave it weight and shape beyond her own memory. Eventually, Hermione shooed Lavender and Parvati away. She needs rest, not an interrogation. And the dormitory settled into a comfortable quiet. Through the window, Eliza could see the rain had stopped, though the sky remained grey and heavy with clouds. The grounds below were empty, everyone driven inside by the weather, but she could just make out the paddock near Hagrid's hut, a small rectangle of fencing against the dark line of the forbidden forest. Were the hippogriffs still out there? Or had Hagrid brought them to shelter? Was Stormdancer grooming his feathers, unbothered by the rain, thinking nothing of the girl who'd ridden him? Or did hippogriffs remember such things, carry some awareness of the humans who'd earned their trust? She wanted to believe he remembered, wanted to think that the connection she'd felt had been mutual, not just her own desperate need for belonging, projected onto an indifferent creature. Eliza, Hermione's voice broke through her thoughts. You should come down for dinner. You must be starving. You barely ate lunch, I noticed. Had it only been this afternoon that she'd sat in the great hall, too nervous to eat, dreading the upcoming lesson? It felt like years ago, like a different version of herself had sat at that table. I'll come down in a minute, Eliza said. I just need a moment. Hermione nodded, understanding, and left, and Eliza was alone again with her thoughts and the grey light filtering through rain-spotted windows. She stood and moved to her trunk, digging beneath her neatly folded clothes until she found what she was looking for, a small journal with a leather cover, its pages mostly empty. She'd bought it in Diagon Alley before third year, thinking she might keep a diary, but had never known what to write. Her days at Hogwarts had seemed too ordinary, too unremarkable to record, but today felt worth remembering. She sat at the small desk by the window, quill in hand, and began to write. Today I flew. I don't mean on a broomstick during flying lessons, or in my dreams, or in some metaphorical sense. I mean I actually flew. on the back of a hippogriff named Storm Dancer over the grounds of Hogwarts, with nothing but air beneath me and sky above. Professor McGonagall said, "The Sorting Hat doesn't make mistakes. I've spent 3 years thinking it made one with me, putting me in Gryffindor when I so clearly didn't belong. But maybe—" She paused, quill hovering over the parchment, searching for the right words. "Maybe bravery isn't what I thought it was. Maybe it's not about charging into danger without fear or being loud and bold and confident. Maybe it's about being terrified and doing the thing anyway, about trusting yourself or someone else, or a creature with talons that could gut you even when every instinct screams to run. I trusted Storm Dancer, and he trusted me back. And for those few minutes in the air, I wasn't thinking about houses or expectations or whether I fit. I was just flying. And it was enough. I was enough." Eliza set down her quill and read over what she'd written. The words looked small on the page, inadequate to capture the enormity of what she'd felt. But they were a start, a record of the moment when something fundamental had shifted inside her chest. A scratch at the window made her jump. She turned to find a school owl perched on the sill, a small piece of parchment tied to its leg. Frowning, she opened the window, letting in a gust of cold, rain-scented air, and retrieved the note. The owl hooted softly and flew away, disappearing into the grey evening. Eliza unrolled the parchment. The handwriting was large and uneven, clearly written by someone more comfortable with creature care than penmanship. "Dear Miss Thornwood, wanted to let ye know that Storm Dancer seems right pleased with himself since the lesson. Keeps preening his feathers and strutting about like he's done something special. Hippogriffs are proud creatures, but they also remember kindness, remember respect. You did real good today. Better than good. You showed the kind of courage that matters most. The quiet kind, the kind that doesn't need an audience. If you'd like to visit him sometime, you're welcome at the paddock. He'd probably like that. Best, Hagrid P.S. Don't tell the other students. I said this, but that were one of the best first flights I've ever seen. You're a natural." Eliza read the note 3 times, something warm and bright expanding in her chest. Hagrid thought she was a natural. Storm Dancer was pleased. She was welcome to visit. She carefully folded the note and placed it between the pages of her journal, pressing it flat. Then she stood, smoothed her robes, and headed for the door. Dinner awaited. Her housemates awaited. Questions and attention, and probably more retellings of the day's events awaited. But for the first time in 3 years, Eliza walked down the spiral staircase toward the common room with her head held high, her shoulders back, her smile genuine and unforced. She had flown. She had been brave. She had discovered something essential about herself that no amount of doubt could erase. The Sorting Hat, she was beginning to believe, had known exactly what it was doing after all. And tomorrow, or the day after, or whenever she gathered the courage, she would visit the paddock again, would approach the fence where Storm Dancer stood with the other hippogriffs, would show him the same respect he'd shown her, would remember what it felt like to trust and be trusted in return. The common room was crowded when she emerged, warm and bright with firelight and the chatter of students comparing homework and making plans for the weekend. Marcus caught her eye from across the room and waved enthusiastically. A group of second years whispered and pointed, not mockingly, but with something like admiration. and Eliza, for the first time since the Sorting Hat, had shouted, "Gryffindor," and sent her life in a direction she'd never expected. Felt like she might actually belong. Not because she'd become someone else, or because she'd learned to be loud and bold and fearless, but because she'd learned that courage came in many forms, and the quiet kind, the kind that whispered instead of roared, the kind that trembled but stepped forward anyway, was just as valid as any other. She had found her roar. It just happened to sound like the beat of wings against wind, and the soft click of a hippogriff's acknowledgement, and the voice inside that said, "I am enough," and finally believed it. The week following her flight with Stormdancer passed in a strange blur of attention and normalcy. Eliza found herself navigating a social landscape that had shifted in subtle but significant ways. Students who'd never spoken to her before now nodded in the corridors. First years stared with wide eyes when she passed, and even some of the Slytherins regarded her with grudging respect rather than dismissive indifference. It was uncomfortable and flattering in equal measure, and Eliza wasn't quite sure what to do with any of it. "You're famous," Lavender declared on Wednesday morning, sliding a copy of the Daily Prophet across the breakfast table. "Well, sort of. Look, page 7, bottom corner." Eliza's stomach dropped as she unfolded the newspaper. There, beneath an article about cauldron bottom regulations, was a small photograph of Hagrid's paddock. The image was taken from a distance, probably by some enterprising student with a camera, but it clearly showed a figure on a dark hippogriff's back, airborne over the Hogwarts grounds. The caption read, "Care of Magical Creatures class continues despite recent injury. Students reportedly flying on hippogriffs under supervision of groundskeeper Rubeus Hagrid." "At least they didn't name you," Hermione said, practically, though her eyes scanned the article with the same speed-reading intensity she brought to everything. "And the tone is fairly neutral. Could have been much worse, given how the Prophet's been covering Hogwarts lately." Eliza pushed her porridge around her bowl, appetite gone. She'd known, logically, that other people had witnessed her flight. The entire class had been there, after all, plus McGonagall, plus whoever might have been watching from castle windows. But seeing it in print, knowing strangers across Wizarding Britain might be reading about it over their own breakfasts, made it feel suddenly real in a way it hadn't before. "Hey!" Marcus appeared at her elbow, having crossed from the Hufflepuff table with his usual disregard for house boundaries at meals. "Don't look so worried. This is good press. For you, for Hagrid, for the Hippogriffs. Shows that the class is successful despite Malfoy's dramatics." "I suppose," Eliza murmured, though she couldn't shake the feeling of being exposed, visible in ways she'd spent 3 years trying to avoid. But beneath the discomfort, something else stirred, a small, secret pride. She'd done that. Shy, quiet Eliza Thornwood had done something noteworthy enough to make the newspaper, even if only as an anonymous figure on a hippogriff back. The morning lessons passed uneventfully. Transfiguration, where Professor McGonagall caught Eliza's eye and offered the smallest of approving nods. History of Magic, where even Binns's droning couldn't entirely suppress the whispered conversations about the upcoming Hogsmeade weekend. And then, after lunch, double potions in the dungeons with the Slytherins. Snape was in a particularly foul mood, which boded ill for everyone, but especially the Gryffindors. He swept into the dungeon like a vengeful bat, his black robes billowing, and immediately began criticizing Harry's cauldron before the poor boy had even added his first ingredient. 10 points from Gryffindor for Potter's inadequate preparation, Snape announced, though Harry's ingredients were laid out in perfect order, and another 5 for the general incompetence I can already predict will plague this lesson. Ron muttered something unflattering under his breath. Hermione's hand shot up with a question about the proper clockwise versus counterclockwise stirring technique, and Eliza bent over her own cauldron, grateful for the anonymity that potions class usually provided. But Snape, it seemed, had other plans. "Miss Thornwood," he said silkily, materializing beside her workstation with the unsettling silence that was his trademark. "I hear you've been branching out in your extracurricular activities." Eliza's hand froze mid-stir. Around the dungeon, she could feel students turning to watch, could sense the collective held breath of Gryffindors waiting to see what Snape would do. "Sir," she managed. "Flying on dangerous creatures," Snape continued, his voice dripping with disdain. "How very Gryffindor. Though I wonder if your potions work might benefit from less time showing off in care of magical creatures and more time actually studying." Heat flooded Eliza's cheeks. "I wasn't showing off, sir. I was participating in the lesson." "Were you?" Snape's black eyes glittered. "And did this participation require making yourself the center of attention? Or could you simply not resist the opportunity for dramatics?" Something hot and unfamiliar sparked in Eliza's chest. For 3 years, she'd absorbed Snape's criticisms in silence, had accepted his casual cruelty as simply the price of being a Gryffindor in his classroom. But now, with Hagrid's note still pressed between the pages of her journal upstairs, with the memory of Stormdancer's trust still vivid in her muscles, she found she couldn't quite swallow the words rising in her throat. "With respect, sir," she said quietly, but clearly enough that the whole dungeon could hear. "I was the last person to volunteer. I wasn't seeking attention. I was trying to overcome my fear." The dungeon went silent. Even the bubbling cauldrons seemed to quiet, as if the potions themselves were holding their breath. Snape's expression darkened. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, and Eliza felt her brief courage wavering. Then his lip curled in something that might have been a sneer, or might have been grudging acknowledgement. 5 points from Gryffindor for talking back, he said finally. "Though I suppose even Gryffindors occasionally stumble upon honest self-reflection. Get back to your potion before you ruin it completely." He swept away toward Harry's cauldron, his preferred target, and Eliza released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Across the dungeon, Ron gave her a subtle thumbs up. Hermione looked impressed. And even Neville, stirring his own potion with careful concentration, shot her a small smile. When the lesson finally ended and they climbed out of the dungeons into the blessed fresh air of the entrance hall, Marcus was waiting. "Did you really tell Snape off?" he demanded, his eyes bright with delight. "Hannah Abbott said she heard from Susan Bones, who heard from Ernie Macmillan, that you stood up to him in potions." "I didn't tell him off," Eliza protested, though she was smiling despite herself. "I just explained. That's all." "That's not all," Hermione said firmly, hefting her book bag higher on her shoulder. "That's standing up for yourself. That's refusing to be diminished by someone who tries to make everyone feel small. That's—" "Gryffindor," Ron finished, grinning. Proper Gryffindor, that. Snape probably hasn't had a third-year talk back to him in years. Well done, Eliza. The warmth in Eliza's chest expanded. She talked back to Snape. Snape, who terrified most students into silent obedience. And while she'd lost house points, she'd also gained something more valuable: the knowledge that she could stand up for herself when it mattered. That evening, after dinner and homework and the general chaos of the common room, Eliza found herself standing at the window of the dormitory, looking out over the grounds. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that reminded her of Stormdancer's eyes. The paddock was too far away to see clearly, but she knew it was there, just beyond Hagrid's hut, and she knew the Hippogriffs were settling in for the night. Hagrid's note had said she was welcome to visit any time. The thought had been circling in her mind all week, a persistent whisper beneath the mundane rhythm of classes and meals and homework. She wanted to see Stormdancer again, wanted to stand before him without the pressure of a watching class, without Hagrid's instructions or her classmates' expectations. Wanted to see if the connection she'd felt had been real or just a product of adrenaline and fear and the desperation to belong. "You should go," Hermione said from behind her. Eliza turned to find her roommate sitting on her bed, a Transfiguration textbook open in her lap, but her attention clearly not on the page. "Go," Eliza echoed. "To visit the Hippogriff, Stormdancer." Hermione closed her book with a decisive snap. "You've been staring out at the grounds every evening since Monday. You're clearly thinking about it, so you should go." "It's almost curfew," Eliza said, though the excuse felt weak, even to her own ears. "It's barely 7, Hermione countered. "You have 2 hours before curfew, and Hagrid's hut is close enough that you'd be back well before then. Besides, I doubt any of the teachers would penalize you for visiting a creature for educational purposes." Educational purposes. As if what Eliza wanted was academic, rather than something she couldn't quite name. A need to confirm that what had happened between her and Stormdancer had been real, significant, mutual. What if he doesn't remember me? The question slipped out before Eliza could stop it, revealing more vulnerability than she'd intended. Hermione's expression softened. "Then you'll know. But I suspect Hippogriffs aren't so different from people in that regard. They remember those who treat them with genuine respect. And you did that. He'll remember." The decision crystallized in that moment, sudden and clear as the first frost of winter. Eliza grabbed her cloak from its hook and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Tell Lavender and Parvati I've gone to the library if they ask," she said. Hermione smiled. "Good luck, though I don't think you'll need it." The castle was quieter in the evening, the frenetic energy of the school day settling into something calmer, more contemplative. Eliza passed a few students on her way through the corridors, as a pair of Ravenclaws arguing about arithmancy formulae. A first year who looked lost and near tears, until Eliza pointed him toward the Hufflepuff common room. Nearly headless Nick drifted through a wall, pausing to greet her with courtly politeness before continuing his eternal rounds. The entrance hall's great oak doors were still open, as they always were until curfew. Eliza slipped through and out onto the stone steps, into the cool evening air that smelled of grass and approaching autumn and the distant smoke from Hagrid's chimney. The grounds were beautiful in the fading light. Long shadows stretched across the lawns, and the lake reflected the sunset like a mirror. In the forbidden forest, she could hear the distant calls of creatures settling in for the night. Thestrals, perhaps, or centaurs, or any of the countless magical beings that called the forest home. Her feet followed the familiar path down toward Hagrid's hut, almost of their own accord. She'd walked this way countless times, for care of magical creatures lessons before Hagrid took over, for the occasional visit when he invited students for tea and rock cakes that could break teeth. But tonight felt different. Tonight, she was walking towards something rather than away from it, driven by want rather than obligation. Hagrid was in his garden when she arrived, tending to the pumpkins that were now the size of boulders. He looked up at her approach, his beetle black eyes widening in surprise, and then pleasure. "Miss Thornwood, didn't expect to see you this evening. Everything all right?" "Yes, sir," Eliza said, suddenly feeling foolish. What if Hagrid thought she was being presumptuous, assuming she could just visit whenever she wanted? You said in your note that I could visit Stormdancer. If this is a bad time, I can—" "Bad time? No such thing." Hagrid wiped his earth-covered hands on his moleskin coat, beaming. "He's in the paddock, they all are. Just finished feeding them. I'm sure he'd be pleased to see you." He walked with her to the paddock fence, his massive strides forcing Eliza to half-jog to keep up. The Hippogriffs were indeed all present, scattered throughout the enclosure in various states of rest and grooming. The chestnut one Dean Thomas had worked with stood near the water trough. The dappled grey that had bowed to Parvati was dozing near the far fence. And there, slightly apart from the others as always, stood Stormdancer. He was preening his wing feathers, his neck twisted at an angle that should have been impossible, his beak working methodically through the dark plumage. In the sunset light, his coat seemed to shimmer with hidden colours, not just grey-black, but hints of deep blue, of purple, of the iridescent green found in raven feathers. "Go on then," Hagrid said gently, opening the gate. "He's been a bit restless all week. Might be he's been expecting ye." The thought sent a flutter through Eliza's stomach. She stepped through the gate, and Hagrid closed it behind her with a soft click. The paddock felt different without the watching class, without the pressure of demonstration. It was just her and the Hippogriffs and the fading light, intimate and quiet. Several of the creatures raised their heads to observe her entrance, but none seemed alarmed. They'd seen her before, after all. She'd proven herself in their terms, but it was Stormdancer whose attention she sought. She approached slowly, following the same ritual as before. Steady steps, calm breathing, no sudden movements. The hay beneath her feet was fresh, crackling softly. The smell was familiar now, animal and wild and something uniquely Hippogriff. Stormdancer stopped preening and turned his head to watch her approach. His amber eyes caught the sunset, glowing like banked coals. For a moment, Eliza's courage faltered. What if he didn't remember? What if the connection she'd felt had been one-sided, a human need projected onto an indifferent creature? But then Stormdancer's ears pricked forward, a sign of interest, of recognition. His head tilted slightly, and he made a soft sound in his throat. The clicking that Hagrid had said meant approval. He remembered. Eliza stopped a respectful distance away and bowed, properly, deeply, giving him the respect he deserved. Her heart hammered as she held the position, but this time the fear was threaded through with anticipation rather than pure terror. The thud of his legs folding was immediate. He bowed back without hesitation, his great head lowering, his wings rustling in greeting. Relief flooded through Eliza so intensely, it nearly brought tears to her eyes. She straightened and found herself smiling, a real smile, unguarded and genuine. "Hello," she said softly. "I hope you don't mind me visiting." Stormdancer stepped closer, closing the distance between them with 2 graceful strides. He was close enough now that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could see her reflection in his eyes. He lowered his head further, bringing it level with her chest, and made that soft clicking sound again. Slowly, giving him time to pull away if he wanted, Eliza reached out and placed her palm against his neck. The feathers were just as she remembered, sleek and warm and alive. She could feel his pulse beneath her hand, steady and strong. "I've been thinking about you," she admitted, speaking quietly, though there was no one to overhear except Hagrid, who tactfully retreated to his garden. "About the flight, about how it felt. I wasn't sure if you'd remember me, or if it had been just another lesson for you." Stormdancer pushed his head gently against her chest, not hard enough to knock her over, but with enough pressure to be deliberate. A gesture, Eliza realized. Acknowledgement, connection. He remembered, and more than that, he was pleased she'd come back. They stood like that for several minutes, girl and hippogriff, as the sunset faded to twilight and the first stars began to appear overhead. Eliza stroked his neck and talked to him in whispers about her week, about standing up to Snape, about the strange new feeling of being visible in ways both uncomfortable and right. And Stormdancer listened, his ears swiveling to catch her voice, his body relaxed and content. Occasionally, he'd make that clicking sound, or nuzzle against her hand, or simply breathe in her scent with his sharp, curved beak. "You've got a gift," Hagrid said eventually, appearing at the fence with a lantern as the darkness deepened. "Not many people can connect with magical creatures like that. It's not just about being brave or following the rules. It's about understanding, about seeing them as they really are, not just as what you want them to be." Eliza looked up at Stormdancer's eyes, seeing the intelligence there, the personality. He wasn't just a magical creature to be studied or a beast to be mastered. He was himself, proud and fierce and a little bit lonely, choosing to share his space with someone who understood what that felt like. "Can I?" Eliza hesitated, then pushed forward. "Can I come back to visit him?" "Course you can." Hagrid's smile was bright even in the lantern light. "Any time you like, long as it's before curfew or you've got permission to be out after. Stormdancer clearly likes you, and I think the visits would do him good. Do you both good, maybe?" As Eliza finally, reluctantly said goodbye to Stormdancer, one final stroke of his neck, one final bow of respect, and made her way back toward the castle, she felt something settle inside her chest. A rightness, a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with house colors or sorting decisions. She belonged here, not because she was loud or bold or fearless, but because she'd found her own kind of courage, the kind that whispered instead of roared, the kind that trembled but stepped forward anyway, the kind that connected rather than conquered. The castle rose before her, its windows glowing warm with light, and Eliza climbed toward it with her head high and her heart full. She had found her place, not just in Gryffindor Tower, but in herself, and tomorrow, and the day after, and all the days to come, She would remember what it felt like to stand before a proud creature and earn his trust, would remember what it felt like to fly. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of perfect autumn weather that made Hogwarts look like something from a storybook. Crisp air that smelled of wood smoke and fallen leaves, golden sunlight slanting through the castle windows, and a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. Students poured out onto the grounds after breakfast, eager to enjoy the weekend before winter properly set in and drove everyone indoors. Eliza found herself walking toward the paddock without conscious decision, her feet following a path that had become familiar over the past week. She'd visited Stormdancer 3 times since that first evening, each visit reinforcing the connection between them, each conversation with Hagrid teaching her more about hippogriffs and their needs and the subtle language of their body movements. Today, though, felt different. There was an energy in the air, a sense of something approaching completion, like the last page of a chapter waiting to be turned. The paddock was busier than usual. Hagrid had mentioned at breakfast that he'd be working with the hippogriffs this morning, grooming them, checking their health, ensuring their wings were in good condition. Several students had volunteered to help, including Harry, Ron, and Hermione. Even Neville was there, tentatively approaching one of the gentler hippogriffs under Hagrid's watchful eye. "Eliza," Marcus called from the fence, waving enthusiastically. "Come help. Hagrid's teaching us proper grooming techniques." She joined him at the fence, watching as Hagrid demonstrated on Buckbeak the proper way to run your hands along the flight feathers, checking for damage or parasites, how to clean the talons without getting yourself disemboweled in the process. It was intricate work, requiring patience and respect in equal measure. "Want to try with Stormdancer?" Hagrid asked, noticing her arrival. "He's due for a proper groom, and I reckon he'd let you do it better than he'd let me." The idea sent a thrill through Eliza, not of fear this time, but of anticipation. Another level of trust, another way to connect with the creature who'd become so important to her in such a short time. She entered the paddock with the ease of familiarity now, no longer tentative or uncertain. Stormdancer was dozing near the far fence, his head tucked under one wing, in a posture that looked uncomfortable, but apparently wasn't. He stirred at her approach, raising his head and making that soft clicking sound that she'd come to recognize as his greeting. "Hello," she said, bowing as she always did. "Hagrid says you need grooming. Will you let me?" Stormdancer bowed back, their ritual now, their mutual acknowledgement, and stepped closer. From a bucket Hagrid had left nearby, Eliza retrieved the grooming tools, a stiff brush for the feathers, a softer one for the hide, a pick for cleaning the talons, and a cloth for the final polish. She started with his neck, brushing carefully through the feathers, working from the base outward the way Hagrid had demonstrated. Stormdancer leaned into the touch, clearly enjoying the attention. His eyes half closed in contentment, and his breathing deepened into the slow rhythm of complete relaxation. "You like this, don't you?" Eliza murmured, working her way along his shoulder. A few small feathers came loose in the brush. Molting, Hagrid had explained, was normal for hippogriffs in autumn. She collected them carefully, thinking they might make a nice quill if she asked Hagrid's permission to keep one. As she worked, she became aware of voices behind her. A small crowd had gathered at the fence, students who'd heard about the hippogriff grooming and come to watch, or perhaps just curious about the girl who'd been visiting the paddock so regularly. Among them, she spotted Professor McGonagall standing slightly apart, her expression unreadable, but her attention focused entirely on Eliza and Stormdancer. Eliza's hands faltered for a moment. An audience. Of course, nothing at Hogwarts stayed private for long, and her relationship with Stormdancer had become something of a minor legend in the past week. The shy Gryffindor and the proud Hippogriff who'd accepted her. But Stormdancer made a questioning sound, nudging her hand, and Eliza realized he didn't care about the Watchers. His world in this moment consisted of her hands on his feathers, the pleasant sensation of being groomed, the comfortable companionship of someone he trusted. The rest didn't matter to him. So why should it matter to her? She continued grooming, moving to his wings. These required extra care. The flight feathers were crucial. Any damage could affect his ability to fly. She ran her fingers along each one, checking for breaks or bent quills, marveling at their structure. Each feather was a miracle of design, lightweight but strong, flexible but resilient. "You're doing great," Hagrid called softly. "See how relaxed he is? That's trust, that is. Pure trust." Trust. The word resonated through Eliza, carrying weight beyond its simple definition. Stormdancer trusted her to touch his wings, the source of his freedom, his greatest vulnerability. Trusted her not to hurt him, not to betray the faith he'd placed in her with that first returned bow. And she trusted him back, trusted him to carry her into the sky, to keep her safe when every instinct screamed that she was in danger, trusted that their connection was real and mutual and worth the risk of being vulnerable. "Miss Thornwood." Professor McGonagall's voice made Eliza look up. The professor had entered the paddock, moving with her characteristic brisk efficiency. "A word, if you please." Eliza's heart sank. Had she done something wrong? Was she in trouble for spending so much time at the paddock? She gave Stormdancer's neck a final pat and moved to meet the professor, trying not to let her anxiety show. But McGonagall's expression, when Eliza got close enough to see it clearly, wasn't stern. It was something else, something that might almost be called warm, if such a word could be applied to Professor McGonagall. "I've been watching your progress this week," McGonagall said, her voice pitched for privacy despite the watching students. "Both in your classes and here with the Hippogriffs. Your transfiguration work has improved markedly. Your confidence in answering questions has grown. And from what I hear from Professor Snape, though he'd never admit it directly, you've begun to find your voice even in his classroom." Eliza felt heat rise to her cheeks. Thank you, Professor." "Don't thank me. You've done the work yourself." McGonagall paused, then continued more softly. "When you were sorted 3 years ago, I wondered if the hat had perhaps been hasty. You seemed so uncertain, so unlike the typical Gryffindor student. I thought you might have been happier in Ravenclaw, or perhaps Hufflepuff, with your friend Mr. Bellamy." The words struck Eliza like a physical blow. Even McGonagall had thought she didn't belong. But the professor wasn't finished. "I was wrong. The hat saw what I didn't. That courage isn't always immediately visible. Sometimes it needs the right circumstances to emerge, the right challenge, the right—" She glanced at Stormdancer. "Connection." "I was so scared," Eliza admitted quietly. "I'm still scared sometimes, of getting things wrong, of not being what everyone expects, of being brave and being scared aren't opposites, Miss Thornwood. They're companions. You cannot have one without the other. McGonagall's lips twitched in what might have been the ghost of a smile. The bravest people I've ever known were also the most frightened. They simply chose to act despite their fear, not in its absence. She reached into her robes and withdrew a small pin, bronze shaped like a hippogriff in mid-flight, beautifully detailed despite its small size. "This belonged to my grandmother," McGonagall said, pressing it into Eliza's hand. "She was a Gryffindor, class of 1890. She worked with magical creatures her entire life and always said that understanding another being, truly understanding them, required the greatest courage of all, the courage to be vulnerable, to admit you don't have all the answers, to trust and be trusted in return." Eliza stared at the pin, its weight surprisingly substantial in her palm. "Professor, I couldn't possibly—" "You can, and you will." McGonagall's tone brooked no argument. "Consider it a reminder. When you doubt yourself, when fear threatens to paralyze you, remember that you stood before a proud creature and earned his respect. Remember that you climbed onto his back and trusted him to carry you into the sky. Remember that you are, and always have been, exactly where you belong." Before Eliza could respond, McGonagall had turned and was striding back toward the castle, her tartan robes billowing in the autumn breeze. Eliza stood frozen, the pin warming in her hand, her throat tight with emotion she couldn't quite name. "What did she want?" Marcus asked, when Eliza finally made her way back to the fence, Stormdancer following her like a massive, lethal puppy. "To tell me I belong," Eliza said simply, and showed him the pin. Marcus's eyes widened. "That's Eliza, that's incredible. McGonagall never gives anything away. Everyone knows that. She must really believe in you." "She does," Hermione said, having apparently been eavesdropping. "We all do. You've changed this term, Eliza. You're still you, still quiet, still thoughtful. But there's something else now. Confidence, maybe, or just sureness. Like you finally figured out who you are." Had she? Eliza looked down at the pin, then up at Stormdancer, who was watching her with his intelligent amber eyes. She thought about the girl who'd sat in the Gryffindor common room a week ago, terrified of the upcoming lesson, convinced she didn't belong. She thought about the moment of bowing, of trusting, of choosing courage over comfort. She thought about flying. "I think," Eliza said slowly, "I've figured out that who I am is enough. I don't have to be loud or bold or fearless to be Gryffindor. I just have to be willing to try, to face my fears even when I'm shaking, to trust even when it's terrifying." "That's what bravery is," Neville said quietly. He'd approached without Eliza noticing, his round face serious. Not being unafraid, just doing it anyway. Around them, the other students who'd gathered to watch, some Gryffindors, some from other houses, even a few of the younger years, nodded in agreement. And Eliza realized with a start that her story had become something larger than herself, that by facing her fears publicly, by choosing vulnerability over safety, she'd given others permission to do the same. The shy Gryffindor who flew. That's what they were calling her, Marcus said. Not as mockery, but as inspiration. Proof that courage came in many forms, that you didn't have to be Harry Potter or Hermione Granger or any of the loud, obvious heroes to be brave. "Would you like to fly one more time?" Hagrid asked, appearing beside the paddock fence with his characteristic timing. before it gets too cold for comfortable flying. Storm Dancer's all groomed and ready, and I think he'd enjoy it. One more flight. The thought sent the now familiar combination of fear and excitement through Eliza's chest. She'd been on the ground for a week, and part of her had started to wonder if that first flight had been a fluke, a one-time miracle that couldn't be repeated. But Storm Dancer was watching her expectantly, his head tilted in that way that suggested he was asking a question. And suddenly, Eliza understood. This wasn't about proving anything to the watching students, or even to herself. This was about honoring the connection she and Storm Dancer had built, about accepting the gift of flight he'd offered, and offering her own gift in return, trust. "Yes," she said, moving to the gate. "Yes, I'd like that very much." This time, mounting was easier. She knew where to place her hand, how to find the wing joint with her foot, how to pull herself up without fighting Storm Dancer's movements. This time, when she settled onto his back and wrapped her fingers in his feathers, it felt less like clinging to survival and more like coming home. Storm Dancer didn't wait for instruction. He knew what Eliza wanted, what they both wanted. He moved forward into a walk, then a trot, then that powerful run that built speed and momentum. The watching students cheered as his wings spread, as his hooves left the ground, as Girl and Hippogriff rose into the perfect autumn sky. And this time, Eliza didn't close her eyes or bury her face in his feathers. This time, she looked. The world spread out beneath them in breathtaking detail. Hogwarts Castle with its towers and turrets, the lake gleaming like a jewel, the forbidden forest stretching to the mountains beyond, the Quidditch pitch, the greenhouses, the paddock where students waved and shouted encouragement. All of it beautiful, all of it magical, all of it home. Storm Dancer climbed higher, his wings beating steady and strong. The wind pulled at Eliza's hair and brought tears to her eyes, but she was smiling, laughing actually, bright and free and unguarded. Up here, she wasn't the shy Gryffindor or the girl who didn't quite fit. She was simply Eliza, flying through the sky on the back of a creature who trusted her, experiencing magic in its purest, most elemental form. They flew over the lake, low enough that Eliza could see the giant squid's tentacles breaking the surface, waving at them in what might have been greeting. They circled the castle, passing windows where students pressed their faces to the glass, pointing and waving. They soared towards the mountains, close enough that Eliza could see individual trees, individual rocks, the small paths that wound through the wilderness. And then, Storm Dancer did something he hadn't done the first time. He climbed even higher, above the castle towers, above the clouds that had begun to gather. For a moment, they were suspended in pure blue, sky above, sky below, nothing but air and light and the steady beat of wings. Eliza spread her arms wide, trusting her legs and her grip on Storm Dancer's feathers to keep her secure, and let herself feel it all. The wind, the light, the impossible freedom of flight. She understood now why Storm Dancer had seemed restless on the ground. This was what he was meant for, what his entire being was designed to do. And for these brief, perfect moments, he'd shared it with her. "Thank you," she whispered, knowing he couldn't hear her over the wind, but needing to say it anyway. "Thank you for trusting me. Thank you for showing me who I could be." Storm Dancer called out, that mix of eagle shriek and horse whinny, and began their descent. This time, Eliza was ready for the swoop of her stomach, the rush of the ground rising to meet them. She leaned with his movements, trusted his judgment, let herself be carried rather than trying to control or fight. The landing was smoother than the first time. Stormdancer's hooves touched earth with practiced grace, his wings spreading wide for balance before folding against his sides. The watching students erupted in applause and cheers, but Eliza barely heard them. She slid from Stormdancer's back and immediately turned to face him, bowing deeply in gratitude and respect. He bowed back without hesitation, then did something he'd never done before. He stepped forward and gently pressed his beak against her chest, over her heart, a gesture of acknowledgement, of acceptance, of something that felt almost like friendship. Eliza's eyes burned with tears she didn't try to hide. She wrapped her arms around Stormdancer's neck, as far as they would reach around his massive form, and held on for a moment, breathing in his scent of feathers and wind and wild places. "I'll come back," she promised quietly, "as often as I can, if you'll have me." Stormdancer's clicking sound was answer enough. When Eliza finally made her way back to the fence, she was immediately surrounded by students offering congratulations, asking questions, wanting to know every detail. But through the crowd, she caught Marcus's eye and saw understanding there, saw that he knew this had been about more than flying, more than conquering fear. This had been about transformation, about discovering that courage lived not in the absence of fear, but in its presence, about learning that belonging wasn't something you had to earn through performance or pretense, but something you claimed by being authentically, vulnerably yourself. That evening, back in Gryffindor Tower, Eliza pinned McGonagall's Hippogriff brooch to her robes just above her heart. The bronze caught the firelight, gleaming warm and beautiful. Around her, the common room buzzed with its usual weekend energy. Students studying, playing chess, arguing about Quidditch, simply being together. And for the first time since the Sorting Hat had placed her in this house, Eliza felt completely at peace with where she was. Not because she'd become someone else, but because she'd finally understood that she'd been enough all along. The Sorting Hat didn't make mistakes. It had seen something in her that she'd needed 3 years and one proud hippogriff to discover. That true courage whispered instead of roared, that it trembled but stepped forward anyway, that it trusted and was trusted in return. She was Gryffindor. Not in spite of her quiet nature, but because of it, because she'd faced her fears and chosen vulnerability over safety, because she'd stood before a creature that could kill her and offered respect instead of dominance, because when given the choice between comfort and growth, she'd chosen to fly. Outside the tower windows, night had fallen over the Hogwarts grounds. In the paddock near Hagrid's hut, a storm-coloured hippogriff settled in for sleep, his dreams full of sky, and the girl who'd understood what it meant to be both proud and lonely, fierce and gentle, wild and trusting. And in Gryffindor Tower, Eliza Thornwood opened her journal and wrote, "Today, I flew again. And this time, I wasn't afraid. Well, I was. But the fear didn't stop me. Because I've learned that being brave doesn't mean not being scared. It means being scared and doing it anyway. It means trusting yourself or someone else or a creature with wings that can carry you into the sky, even when every instinct screams to stay safe on the ground." The Sorting Hat was right. I do belong here. Not because I'm loud or bold or fearless, but because I'm willing to try. To face what frightens me, to be vulnerable enough to connect with others, human and creature alike. I am Gryffindor, and that is enough. I am enough. She closed the journal and looked at the brooch on her robes, at the hippogriff forever frozen in flight. Tomorrow, she would wake up and go to classes and visit Storm Dancer in the paddock. She would continue to be quiet, thoughtful, sometimes uncertain. She would still feel afraid, but she would also remember what it felt like to fly, to trust, to discover that courage lived not in the absence of fear, but in its presence. And that would be enough. That would always be enough. The fire crackled in the grate, the portraits murmured on the walls, and in the heart of Gryffindor Tower, a shy girl who'd learned to be brave finally came home to herself.